Giving birth can make someone a mother by blood. Staying is what makes her a mother in a child's life. My sister left her 4-year-old daughter with me and spent nearly 15 years building another family while I raised the little girl who kept waiting for her to come back. Then one evening, Vanessa appeared at my door and called me cruel for keeping her from her own daughter. She looked at me and said, "Tell me what raising her cost. I'll pay you back, or I'll sue." As if childhood could be reimbursed. As if 15 years of broken promises could be turned into a receipt. But Vanessa had made one mistake. She thought I was the only person who knew what really happened. Then 19-year-old June stepped forward. What happened next did not just expose the lie Vanessa had lived behind for years. It forced her to face consequences she never imagined would reach her. If your family has ever expected you to carry what someone else abandoned, I hope you'll stay with me until the end. And if stories like this mean something to you, you're always welcome to subscribe and come back for the next one. 20 minutes before Vanessa appeared, the biggest problem in my house had been half a tank of gas. Technically, it was less than half a tank. Toby insisted that distinction mattered. June insisted it mattered even more that he had been the last person to drive my car. I was standing at the kitchen island cutting tomatoes for dinner, while the two of them conducted the kind of argument siblings can sustain for 10 minutes, without either side introducing a single useful fact. June had one hand wrapped around a sweating glass of iced tea. Toby was leaning against the refrigerator with the confidence of a 17-year-old who believed an absence of witnesses was the same thing as innocence. Graham sat at the table, sorting through a stack of mail, listening without looking up. According to June, Toby had borrowed my car to pick up a friend and returned it with the fuel light threatening to come on. According to Toby, the car had already been basically empty, which was a phrase he apparently believed had legal meaning. Graham finally looked over the top of an envelope and said the vehicle seemed to run almost entirely on accusation. June laughed first. Toby tried not to and failed. That was what our house sounded like most evenings by then. Not perfect. Not peaceful in any sentimental sense. There were shoes where shoes did not belong. Cups abandoned in rooms by people who swore they had never seen them before. A teenager who believed laundry baskets were decorative, and another who had somehow claimed half the bathroom counter without ever admitting she owned that many products. Ordinary problems. I had learned to treasure ordinary problems. June was 19 now, home between classes and shifts at the campus library. Toby was 17 and had recently developed strong opinions about cars he did not pay insurance on. Graham still folded junk mail into perfect halves before throwing it away, as if even garbage deserved proper handling. I had spent most of the day at work solving a scheduling problem involving 3 crews, 2 suppliers, and 1 client who seemed personally offended by calendars. Nothing about that Thursday evening felt important. Then the doorbell rang. I wiped tomato juice from my fingers and went to answer it with the irritation of someone expecting a delivery driver who had forgotten where to leave a package. Instead, I opened the door and saw Vanessa. For a second, my brain did not catch up with my eyes. I knew my sister's face. Of course I did. Family photographs had preserved older versions of it, and social media had occasionally offered newer ones. When Linda, our mother, shared something before, remembering I did not ask. Vanessa had always photographed well. Even at 45, she carried herself with the same polished certainty I remembered from our 20s, the kind that made people straighten slightly when she entered a room. But standing 3 feet from her was different. There were more lines around her eyes. Her hair was shorter than the last picture I had seen. She wore a cream blouse beneath a fitted jacket that looked wrong for the Sacramento heat, and she had one hand locked around the handle of a structured leather bag, as though it was the only object on the porch that had agreed to behave. She looked past me, before she really looked at me. That was the first thing I noticed. Her eyes moved over my shoulder, searching the hallway. I stepped slightly into the doorway. Vanessa's mouth tightened. She said she had been trying to handle things privately and reasonably, but apparently I had left her no choice. She said enough years had passed. She said June was an adult now. She said I could no longer decide whether a mother was allowed to have a relationship with her own daughter. The word allowed landed strangely. For 15 years, I had packed lunches, signed school forms, waited outside fitting rooms, learned which headaches meant June needed water, and which meant she had been staring at a screen too long. I had sat awake through fevers and first heartbreaks, and one terrifying night, when she had gotten her driver's license and did not answer her phone for 27 minutes because she had left it on silent in a movie theater. I had never once thought of motherhood as permission I controlled. Vanessa apparently had. She called me cruel. Not loud, not hysterical. That would almost have been easier. She said it with the calm certainty of someone who had repeated the sentence enough times that it no longer sounded absurd in her own ears. According to her, I had spent years making June believe there was no room for Vanessa. I had built myself into the center of June's life, then convinced everyone that Vanessa's absence had been a choice. I felt my fingers curl against the edge of the door. This one slipped under my ribs because it touched a fear I had carried for years, that becoming the person who always showed up had made it easier for Vanessa not to. Vanessa knew me well enough to know exactly where that fear lived. Maybe that was why she smiled when she saw I had not answered yet. Then she made it worse. "Tell me what raising her cost," she said. "I'll pay you back. Or I'll sue." The sounds from the kitchen stopped. Not gradually. Completely. I looked at Vanessa's hand on her bag, at the pale polish on her nails, at the thin gold watch on her wrist. Behind me, our air conditioner kicked on with a dull mechanical hum. For a moment, all I could picture was a 4-year-old sitting on the edge of a guest room bed in socks that did not match because she had insisted her father used to let her pick her own. Then 7 years old, trying to stay awake long enough for a promised phone call. Then 12, pretending she did not care about a school assignment that asked for a family tree. 16, asking me once whether being grateful and being angry could happen at the same time. There were receipts for some of those years. Grocery bills, orthodontics, school supplies, gas, shoes that lasted 6 months because children have the indecency to grow. But Vanessa had not asked what we spent. She had asked what raising June cost. As if Graham's exhaustion could be itemized. As if Toby's childhood could be reimbursed. As if every decision our family had made to keep June from feeling temporary came with a number at the bottom. I did not give her the satisfaction of shouting. I asked her one question. "Sue me for what?" Her expression shifted almost too quickly to catch. Not fear, irritation. She said there were laws against interfering with a parent-child relationship. She said lawyers could explain it better than she could. She said I should not assume that because June was 19 now, the things I had done when she was younger no longer mattered. It sounded rehearsed around the edges and vague in the center. I had spent too many years working in operations to trust a threat that came without nouns. Before I could tell her to leave, I heard a chair scrape across the kitchen floor. June had come into the hallway. She wore faded jeans and one of Graham's old college sweatshirts despite the August heat, because she claimed every building in California was refrigerated for penguins. Her dark hair was twisted loosely at the back of her head. She had lost the easy amusement from the gas argument. The change in her face was so complete that for 1 second, she looked younger. Not 4. But young enough to make something inside me move before I could stop it. I stepped back and angled myself between June and the open door. It was instinct. I had been doing versions of it for 15 years. At hospitals, at school offices, during awkward conversations with relatives who asked questions June should never have had to answer. My body had learned before my mind did that when something came toward her, I moved first. June touched my arm, not to pull me away, just enough to make me notice. Then she stepped sideways, until she was no longer behind me. Vanessa looked at her daughter. I watched hope appear on my sister's face so fast that it almost made me angry all over again. There was hunger in it, but not the kind I wanted to trust. It looked too much like relief. June did not move closer. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then she looked directly at Vanessa. "Before you threaten Mom," she said quietly, "maybe you should tell her what you said to me 3 years ago." I turned toward June. Vanessa's face emptied. The color left so visibly that I noticed the faint pink of lipstick before I noticed anything else. My first thought was that I had misheard the number. 3 years ago, June would have been 16. My second thought was worse. Whatever June was talking about, Vanessa understood immediately. There was no confusion on Vanessa's face. Recognition arrived before defense. She recovered quickly, said the situation had been complicated, and June too young to understand everything she had been dealing with. Then she looked at me instead of June, and suggested that some of June's conclusions had been shaped by my household. June's fingers tightened around her sweatshirt cuff. She said only that Vanessa knew exactly what she meant, and somehow the absence of explanation made the hallway feel smaller. I wanted to ask June what had happened. The question was already pushing against my teeth, but June was staring at Vanessa, not me. For once, whatever existed between them did not belong to me to manage. Vanessa shifted strategies. She said she had come because she wanted to make things right before lawyers and strangers made everything uglier. She wanted time alone with June. She wanted Andrea. She had started calling me by name now, as if my sister no longer suited the version of the story she needed to acknowledge in writing, that June had originally stayed in Sacramento because stability had been best for her. The wording caught my attention because it was not entirely false. June had been 4, grieving, attached to our home, her preschool, Toby and me. The danger was what Vanessa wanted that truth to erase. A sentence that began with stability and ended before anyone asked who had been responsible for maintaining it. She wanted a sentence that began with stability and ended before anyone asked who had been responsible for maintaining it. She also wanted me to stop telling people she had abandoned June. I almost laughed at that, though nothing about it was funny. I could not remember the last time I had discussed Vanessa socially with anyone who did not already know the history. Most people in my adult life simply knew June was my daughter. Some knew I was her aunt by blood. I had never needed a campaign against Vanessa. Nearly 15 years of distance had required very little assistance from me. June said she would not meet privately that day. Vanessa looked at me immediately, as if I had issued the refusal through some invisible signal. June saw it. Her jaw moved once before she said, "That was my answer." I had nothing useful to add. Behind us, Graham entered the hallway. He did not puff up or demand Vanessa leave his property. Graham had never confused volume with authority. He took in my shoulders, June's face, Vanessa on the porch, and asked me whether I wanted the door closed. Vanessa's eyes moved to him, then past him, to Toby, standing several feet back. For the first time since arriving, Vanessa seemed to register the whole shape of our family at once. The house, Graham, Toby, who had been 2 when June first slept under our roof, and the framed school photographs along the hall. Her expression hardened. Something hard settled into Vanessa's expression. She said I had built an entire family around replacing her. That sentence hurt more than the money, more than the lawsuit. My palm went cold against the door, because it reached the place in me that still remembered every time I had wondered whether I was doing too much, deciding too much, becoming too central. Graham knew that fear. I had admitted pieces of it to him. Over the years, usually late at night when June was asleep, and my confidence was weakest. Vanessa should not have known it still existed. But sisters know the architecture of each other's wounds, even after they stop being close. Before I could answer, Toby moved. He did not step forward dramatically. He simply came to stand near June, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Vanessa looked at him. Toby had known June as his sister for so long that I doubted he remembered a version of childhood without her. Yet, I could see the calculation on his face as he studied Vanessa, trying to reconcile this polished stranger with the woman whose absence had shaped so many rules in our home without ever being physically present. I became aware of how easily a front door confrontation could become a family scene everyone remembered differently for years, so I stopped it. I told Vanessa I would not sign anything, discuss money, or make decisions for June in the doorway. If her lawyer had something legitimate to send, the lawyer could send it. If June wanted contact, June would decide how and when. Vanessa said I would be hearing from her attorney. I nearly pointed out that she had already said that twice. But let the impulse die. Vanessa left without touching June, and June did not reach after her. I shut the door and turned the deadbolt. Then, without thinking, I checked it again. The hallway stayed silent for several seconds. Toby disappeared first, retreating toward the kitchen with the instinctive wisdom teenagers sometimes display when adults least expect it. Graham remained near the wall, giving June room. I looked at my daughter. 3 years. The number sat between us. I wanted dates, messages, context, and the old version of me would have organized the questions or called Vanessa before the porch light cooled. Instead, I waited. June rubbed her thumb over the seam of her sleeve and said she would tell me, but not then, not while adrenaline was running through us, and not if I was going to turn her story into a problem to solve before she finished telling it. The accuracy of that stung. I told her I could wait. I told June I could wait. She studied my face as if checking whether I meant it. Then she nodded. Dinner was almost absurd afterward. The tomatoes were still on the cutting board. The iced tea had gone watery. Toby reopened the refrigerator twice without taking anything out. Nobody mentioned the gas. We ate because people still have to eat on days when the past knocks on the front door. June stayed at the table with us. That was all I let myself take from the evening. I did not ask about 16. I did not search Vanessa online. I did not call my mother. I did not write the response to a lawsuit that did not yet exist. That last one was harder than it sounds. The next morning, I found the email, just after 7. It had been sent to both my personal address and the address Vanessa's attorney apparently believed I still used for work correspondence. The attached letter came from a family law firm in Santa Clara County. For several seconds, I only stared at the letterhead. Then I printed it. Paper still made threats feel more honest to me. The first page was far less dramatic than Vanessa had been on my porch. Her attorney did not claim Vanessa had any right to custody of June. The letter demanded that I preserve communications, refrain from making allegedly false statements about Vanessa, and consider signing a declaration clarifying the history of Vanessa's attempts to maintain a relationship with her daughter. There was language about potential claims if I knowingly spread false statements that harmed Vanessa. No lawsuit had been filed, and the letter did not turn Vanessa's preferred family history into fact. What did appear more than once was the phrase ongoing custody proceedings. The letter referred to a current family matter involving Chloe and Owen and said Vanessa's history with June had become relevant to disputed allegations. Vanessa had said nothing about that on the porch. That changed the shape of everything. Graham read over my shoulder while I stood at the kitchen counter. He did not offer a theory. Neither did I. I had learned something from the previous night. June came downstairs a few minutes later, with her hair still damp from the shower and a canvas bag hanging from one shoulder. She noticed the printed pages immediately. I told June only what I knew. Vanessa had not filed a lawsuit against me. Her attorney wanted records preserved and a statement about the past, and there was a custody dispute involving Chloe and Owen. June set her bag down. I handed her the letter. Her eyes moved across the first page, then the second. She read faster than I expected. Halfway down the page, she stopped. The change was tiny. Her shoulders did not jerk. Her face did not collapse. Her index finger simply stayed against one line too long. I followed it. The letter summarized Vanessa's position that she had made repeated efforts to reconnect with June over the years, and that those efforts had been obstructed or discouraged by me. I felt something old and furious rise in my chest. June kept reading. Then she laid the pages flat on the counter. That's not what she told me. The sentence was quiet enough that Graham, standing near the coffee maker, turned. I looked at June. She did not explain. Not yet. But for the first time since Vanessa had appeared, I understood that my sister had not come to Sacramento simply because she suddenly wanted her daughter back. She needed something. Something happening in her life now required the last 15 years to look different. And, somehow, my daughter had been holding the piece of the past Vanessa was most afraid I would see. The sentence June had spoken over the letter stayed with me all morning. That's not what she told me. She had not said Vanessa was lying. She had not said what happened 3 years earlier. She had not even looked especially angry when she put the pages back on the kitchen counter. June had simply picked up her canvas bag afterward and gone to class, leaving me with a line I could not stop turning over. For most of my adult life, uncertainty had been something I treated like a broken machine. Find the missing part, tighten what had come loose, make a list. By 8:30, I had opened a document titled Vanessa and started typing dates: Michael's death, Vanessa's move, the guardianship, the last birthday she had actually attended. Graham set a coffee beside my elbow and gave me the look that meant he recognized exactly what I was doing. I closed the document. The attorney I called had been recommended through someone at work. I chose her precisely because she had no connection to my family, no history with Vanessa, and no reason to care which sister sounded more convincing. I wanted law stripped of emotion. What I got was narrower than the threat Vanessa had carried onto my porch. The attorney explained that June was 19. Whatever legal authority I had once held over her had ended when she became an adult. Vanessa could not walk into court and ask a judge to hand her an adult daughter. My old guardianship had not become wrongful simply because Vanessa now disliked what it represented. The cease and desist letter was exactly what it looked like. A lawyer's warning, not a judgment, and not proof that Vanessa had a viable lawsuit against me. If I knowingly spread false statements that damaged Vanessa, that could create a different problem, but refusing to sign Vanessa's preferred version of family history was not defamation. The attorney's advice was simple. Do not contact Vanessa directly, post about the dispute, send emotional messages to relatives, or sign anything under pressure. Preserve whatever records still existed naturally, and remember that a threatening letter was not a court order. That last point embarrassed me more than I wanted to admit. By the time the consultation ended, I had a legal pad covered in neat handwriting and nowhere useful to put the energy still moving through my hands. I began organizing old files anyway. The guardianship papers were in a labeled cabinet, tax records were scanned, and most ordinary school paperwork had disappeared years ago. I caught myself wondering whether every discarded field trip form had been a mistake. I was already turning motherhood into evidence, so I shut the cabinet. When June came home that afternoon, I had managed not to call her 3 times. I considered that progress. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl beside the door and found me in the kitchen. There was something cautious in the way she looked at my empty hands, as if she had expected a folder, a legal pad, or possibly a PowerPoint presentation. She was not entirely wrong about me. I told her the practical part first. Vanessa had not filed a lawsuit against me. The letter did not give her power over June. I had been advised not to sign anything or discuss the situation publicly. Then, I told her I would not contact Vanessa about whatever had happened 3 years ago unless June wanted me to. The tension around her mouth loosened slightly. I almost ruined it by immediately asking whether she wanted me to call someone else. Graham's voice from the dining room saved me from myself. He asked one question, without looking up from the cabinet hinge he was repairing. "What does June want you to do?" I gave him a look he wisely ignored. June leaned one hip against the counter. She said she wanted time. She wanted to understand why Vanessa had come back before deciding what to do about the past. That sounded sensible. It also sounded unbearably slow. I nodded anyway. An hour later, the first answer arrived without me looking for it. The email came from Daniel Reed. I knew the name, though I had never had a real relationship with him. For years, he had existed at the edge of family information. Vanessa's husband, father of Chloe and Owen, the man in photographs beside the sister I barely spoke to. We had met in person only a handful of times, never long enough to become anything resembling family. His message was careful. He said he understood I had received communication from Vanessa's counsel. He was involved in an ongoing custody matter and had encountered inconsistencies in the history Vanessa had provided about June. He was not asking me to choose sides. He wanted to know whether I would be willing to confirm a few dates. I read it twice before answering. Then I showed Graham. Graham reminded me that a man in the middle of a divorce had his own reasons for wanting information about his wife. Being opposed to Vanessa did not automatically make Daniel trustworthy, so I agreed only to a short call and made clear that June's private history was not mine to hand over. Daniel accepted. The call happened the next morning while I sat in my car outside my office. I chose the parking lot because I did not want coworkers walking past while I discussed the wreckage of my sister's life, and because there was something about being enclosed inside a parked car that made difficult conversations easier to contain. Daniel sounded exhausted, rather than theatrical or furious, the way people do when conflict has gone on long enough that anger itself becomes expensive. He told me he and Vanessa had separated in January. He had filed for divorce in February. By March, the court had put a temporary parenting arrangement in place for Chloe and Owen. They were sharing legal custody and roughly equal parenting time while the larger case moved forward. Vanessa's company had offered her a senior promotion in Seattle, with more money and responsibility. She wanted to take Chloe and Owen. Daniel opposed the move. Their current temporary arrangement gave them roughly equal parenting time, and he described the children's lives in ordinary terms: school, friends, doctors, activities, routines. Moving them would turn his daily fatherhood into flights, holidays, and scheduled blocks. I had watched June lose that kind of daily fatherhood once already. Daniel's attorney had argued that Vanessa tended to make major adult decisions first, and then described the distance they created as inevitable. That pattern, not a judgment about whether she had been a good mother 15 years earlier, was how June's history entered the case. She said June's situation had been completely different. Michael had died. June had been traumatized. She had wanted to remain in Sacramento. I had become her stable caregiver. Vanessa had stayed away because disrupting June would have been selfish. Then the story shifted. According to the declaration, over time I had become increasingly controlling. I had discouraged contact. Vanessa had tried to reconnect, but had found herself shut out of a mother-daughter relationship I had made my own. I listened with my forehead against the steering wheel. I had heard pieces of that story on my porch. Hearing Daniel describe how Vanessa had told it over the years was different. Daniel said the version he had lived with during their marriage had been softer. June had chosen stability. Vanessa had sacrificed closeness. I had become important, and court would only have hurt June. He had believed Vanessa made an agonizing choice and respected it even when it cost her. Sitting in my car, I could see how that story allowed Vanessa to think of herself as a woman carrying an old wound rather than one who had helped create it. I did not recite missed weekends or birthdays. I confirmed only what I personally knew. Vanessa moved in 2012. June remained with me. I became her court-appointed guardian in 2014, and Vanessa received notice without opposing it. Anything beyond that could go through counsel. He accepted that more easily than I expected. Before ending the call, he said something that changed the shape of my suspicion. For years, he had understood that Vanessa avoided fighting for greater contact because she did not want June dragged through court. But in the current declaration, Vanessa was claiming something stronger. She was saying I had effectively denied her access. Daniel wanted to know how both things could be true. I had no answer for him. After we hung up, I stayed in the car. The parking lot shimmered in the August heat. A crow hopped between two cars looking for something edible, found a crumpled receipt instead, and pecked at it with more determination than the paper deserved. After we hung up, I stayed in the car as the August heat shimmered over the parking lot. My mind moved past Daniel, Seattle, and guardianship to Michael, and to the beginning I refused to rewrite simply because I knew the ending. They met in their early 20s. Vanessa had already learned how to fill a room, and Michael had the rare ability to be amused by that without being swallowed by it. He was quieter than she was, more comfortable with routine, the kind of man who arrived early because being late felt disrespectful. June had not been an accident they resented. I remembered Vanessa calling me after the positive pregnancy test, crying and laughing so hard I had to ask her to repeat herself twice. I remembered Michael assembling a crib with the concentration of someone disarming a bomb. I remembered my sister falling asleep on the couch with newborn June on her chest, while Michael sat on the floor nearby, because he was convinced both of them were breathing too quietly. Vanessa had loved her daughter. That was one of the hardest truths in the whole story. It would have been simpler if she never had. Their marriage wore down through incompatible ideas of what adulthood should feel like. Michael believed stability was something you built and protected. Vanessa feared too much stability could become a cage. After June was born, Michael wanted a permanent house, predictable schedules, and honest conversations about what each new opportunity required from the family. Vanessa's career was accelerating, and she often heard those conversations as resistance, as if asking what something cost meant, telling her she did not deserve it. By 2010, they were exhausted. The divorce was painful but not theatrical. There were lawyers, schedules, documents, and the quiet humiliation of dividing one household into two. By the time it was final that October, June was 3. They shared parenting. And, for a while, it worked. Michael became the parent with the predictable refrigerator, the extra pair of shoes, the calendar on the wall. Vanessa became more relaxed on the days June was with her, because she knew exactly when her responsibility began and ended. I did not think of it that way then. I only noticed my sister seemed lighter. She traveled for work without scrambling for coverage. She went out with friends on weekends. June was with Michael. When June returned, Vanessa had energy. She planned museum trips. She bought matching pajamas one Christmas. She took pictures of pancakes shaped like animals. Her affection was real. She could be attentive and playful when motherhood arrived in pieces she could manage, and Michael's presence made that structure possible. Then, in July 2011, a highway accident took him away. In July 2011, but a truck changed lanes on the highway. Metal folded, and Michael did not come home. June was 4 years and 2 months old. I still remember an unopened carton of strawberries on Vanessa's kitchen counter because Michael had bought them for June 2 days earlier. Vanessa kept moving around them, as if the room were a puzzle she could solve by refusing to sit down. I remembered standing in Vanessa's kitchen after she received the confirmation. There had been an unopened carton of strawberries on the counter because Michael had bought them for June 2 days earlier. Vanessa kept moving around them, as though the room had become a puzzle she could solve by refusing to sit down. June did not understand death. Not really. She understood absence. She understood that her father's shoes were still by the wall, and his car was not coming back. For the first few weeks, she kept asking questions that no adult could answer without breaking something. Would Dad know where her new preschool room was? Could he hear her if she talked while looking at the sky? Was he coming back after everybody stopped being sad? Michael's parents, Ruth and Thomas, were devastated. Linda and Robert were frightened for Vanessa and June. Graham and I were trying to help without knowing what help meant. And Vanessa had gone from shared custody to sole responsibility overnight. There was no off week anymore. No other parent automatically tracking school paperwork. No house June could go to while Vanessa traveled. No one who already knew which cup June wanted at breakfast or how long it took her to calm down after a nightmare. At the time, I saw mostly grief. Looking back, I could also see that Michael's death had removed the structure that let Vanessa love June without making motherhood the center of her life. My phone vibrated against the passenger seat. Daniel had sent a follow-up through email. Daniel's follow-up was brief. On his attorney's advice, he sent only the portion of Vanessa's declaration, involving facts I might personally know. I opened it at home that evening with Graham beside me. I waited until I was back home that evening to open it. Graham sat beside me at the dining room table. June was upstairs. Toby had gone to a friend's house. I read Vanessa's declaration once, then again more slowly. The first part was exactly as Daniel had described. Michael's death, June's grief, June expressing a wish to remain with me, Vanessa's decision not to uproot her. Then came the part about me. Vanessa said that, as years passed, I increasingly controlled access to June. She said attempts to communicate were discouraged. She said the emotional distance between her and June had become impossible to repair because June had been raised inside a household that viewed Vanessa as someone who had voluntarily walked away. The wording was careful. There were enough true pieces to make the false shape convincing. Then I reached the sentence Daniel had warned me about. Vanessa stated that even as June entered adolescence, June had never independently sought direct contact with her outside my control. If June had contacted her 3 years earlier, that statement might be provably false. I still did not know whether she had, or what Vanessa had said. I heard June on the stairs. She came into the dining room wearing socks and carrying a bowl of cereal despite it being nearly 8 at night. She took one look at the pages spread across the table and stopped. The legal pages spread across our dining table looked strangely harsh against an ordinary evening. I told her Daniel had sent a portion of Vanessa's declaration. I did not tell her how she should feel about it. I turned the pages around. June set the cereal down and read standing up. Her eyes reached the sentence. She did not react the way she had at the lawyer's letter. This time she closed her eyes. Only for a second. Then she pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. I had spent the entire day trying not to ask the question too soon. Now I could not avoid it. I asked whether she had contacted Vanessa herself. June looked at Graham, then at me. Her thumb moved slowly along the edge of the paper. She did not answer yes or no. Instead, she said the one thing that guaranteed I would spend another night waiting. Before I tell you what happened, you need to understand why I went looking for her. June's sentence stayed with me long after she went upstairs. Before I tell you what happened, you need to understand why I went looking for her. At first, I thought she meant there was something I had missed in the years after Vanessa left. Some conversation I had forgotten. Some promise June had taken more seriously than I realized. Some moment when a child's question had turned into a teenager's need for an answer. But that night, sitting at the dining room table with Vanessa's sworn declaration still spread between Graham and me, I knew the only way to understand why June had gone looking for her mother at 16 was to go back to the point when none of us believed there was anything to look for. I went back to 2011, when I was 27. Graham was 30, Toby was 2, and June's feet still did not touch the floor at our kitchen table. Before Michael died, my life was not empty. Graham and I had been married 5 years, owned a new mortgage, worked full schedules, and had not decided whether the third bedroom would remain an office or become a nursery. We were tired, paying for childcare, and already stretched. We were not unhappy. We were simply full. That was the life Michael's death entered. The phone call came on a Tuesday in July. I remember that because I was reviewing a staffing spreadsheet when my mother called, and because for years afterward, the sight of highlighted cells on a Tuesday morning could bring back the exact sound of Linda's voice. Michael had been in an accident. There had been a truck, a lane change, emergency crews, a hospital. Then there was no Michael. Everything after that moved in the ugly, practical sequence that follows sudden death. Flights and phone calls. Funeral clothes. People bringing food nobody wanted. June asking why everyone kept touching her hair. Ruth standing beside Michael's coffin with both hands wrapped around a folded tissue she never used. Vanessa moved through those first days, as if stopping would be dangerous. She handled flowers, corrected the funeral program, found June's missing shoes, and rarely cried in front of us. I knew movement was how my sister stayed ahead of pain. June, at 4, could not keep up with it. At 4, grief did not look like grief the way adults expected it to. June did not sit quietly and talk about missing her father. She asked where he was. Then she asked again. She wanted to know whether he could see the new drawing she made. She asked if he would still come to preschool pickup. She refused to let Ruth wash one of Michael's old t-shirts because it smelled like him. She started waking before dawn and walking through the house until she found an adult. For the first week after the funeral, Vanessa stayed in the apartment she had shared with June since the divorce. By the second week, she called me after midnight. June had been awake for nearly 3 hours. Vanessa had an early meeting the next morning. She sounded exhausted enough that even her sentences felt thin. Graham was asleep beside me. Toby was sprawled sideways across his crib monitor, one bare foot pressed against the slats. I drove over. That was the first night I put June back to bed after Michael died. I did not know it would become a pattern. A few days later, Vanessa asked if she and June could stay with us temporarily. She came too. She was not handing June over and disappearing. For a long time, I genuinely believed I was helping my sister remain a mother. Graham agreed before I finished explaining, and we moved the desk out of the third bedroom. We moved the desk out of the small third bedroom and gave it to June. Vanessa slept in the den off the living room, where we set up a daybed and a folding screen for privacy. Toby stared at the extra suitcases lined against the wall, as if our house had become an airport. The first weeks were chaos disguised as family cooperation. June had trouble sleeping. Toby had trouble understanding why someone else now cried loudly enough to summon his mother. Vanessa had trouble being still. I had trouble admitting any of us were in trouble. At night, June would sometimes wake and call for her father before remembering. That was the part I hated most. The instant between waking and knowing. A child could lose a parent twice in less than 10 seconds. Once in the accident, again every morning. I tried not to make myself indispensable. If June woke, I first took her to Vanessa. School forms went to Vanessa's side of the counter. I reminded her about shoes instead of simply buying them. I was trying to preserve the roles June still had left. Vanessa as her mother, me as her aunt. For a while, Vanessa tried too. She took June to preschool when her schedule allowed. She sat through bedtime stories, even when her eyes kept moving toward her phone. She took June to Ruth and Thomas's house one weekend and came back with 2 bags of leftovers and a headache. Then work began to reclaim her. At first, I understood. Vanessa had taken time off around Michael's death. Bills still existed. Her employer had been patient. But patience in corporate life usually came with an invisible expiration date. She returned to the office. Then she started leaving earlier, then later. A meeting meant I did pick up. A client dinner meant Graham handled bath time while I helped June through another night of asking whether people could die twice. One preschool pickup became 3. One bedtime became most weeknights. Vanessa did not announce that she was stepping away from motherhood. I do not think she experienced it that way. She experienced each decision individually. One late meeting. One difficult morning. One night when June would not stop asking about Michael and Vanessa said she could not do it anymore. One Saturday when she went for coffee and stayed gone until mid-afternoon because she needed air. Every individual choice was survivable. Together, they began forming a life. Mine. Graham noticed before I did, because his life was the one shifting beside mine. One evening, he came home to find Toby attached to my leg, June on the counter because she refused to be alone, and Vanessa's dinner untouched because she would be late again. He quietly took over until the crisis passed, then asked whether we had ever discussed how long the arrangement was supposed to last. I heard judgment where he was asking a harder question. Did I understand the difference between helping and absorbing? I did not yet. June made the question harder, because she was not miserable every minute. Children do not respect emotional continuity. They can wake screaming at 3 in the morning and laugh so hard at breakfast that milk comes out of their nose. One Saturday, about 2 months after Vanessa and June moved in, June decided the living room needed a castle. She dragged blankets from her bed, 2 dining chairs, 3 couch cushions, and 1 fitted sheet I had been looking for since laundry day. Toby watched with the dangerous concentration of a toddler witnessing architecture. Graham was repairing a loose cabinet hinge. I was trying to finish a work report at the dining table. June spent nearly half an hour building the thing. It had rooms, rules, a front entrance made from 2 pillows balanced badly against each other. She crawled inside with a flashlight and a handful of crackers, then emerged to announce that Toby was not allowed in because he was too destructive. Toby responded by walking directly through one wall. The entire structure collapsed. June stood in the middle of the blankets with both fists at her sides, outraged enough that for a second I thought we were heading toward disaster. She informed us, Toby was banned from the castle forever. Graham looked at the collapsed sheet and said the castle appeared to have filed for bankruptcy. June did not understand the joke. I did. 10 minutes later, I saw her crouched beside what remained of the blanket wall, pushing crackers through a gap toward Toby. When I asked what she was doing, she said he was still banned, but might get hungry. I remember the blanket castle because it was one of the first times I saw June as something other than a grieving child. A bossy 4-year-old, whose 2-year-old cousin had destroyed her fort, banned him forever, then secretly pushed crackers through the wreckage because he might get hungry. I laughed, and so did Vanessa when I told her later. Sometimes Vanessa seemed relieved by June's happiness with us, and at first I mistook that relief for recovery. I began noticing other things. I also noticed June reaching for me first after a scraped knee at preschool pickup in the middle of the night. I hated it enough that I kept redirecting small things toward Vanessa. The drawing, the dress, the preschool picnic. I was still protecting Vanessa's place long after she had stopped asking me to. Linda made it easier for all of us to avoid naming what was happening. My mother drove up every couple of weeks. She brought groceries, folded laundry I had not asked her to touch, and reminded me that grief did strange things to people. She was not wrong. Vanessa had lost the father of her child, even if he was no longer her husband. Linda worried that pressing Vanessa too hard would push her into something worse. She asked me to give my sister time. Time to work. Time to breathe. Time to figure out who she was after Michael. I asked once how much time June was supposed to understand. Linda looked away. That was as close as we came to admitting there might be 2 different clocks running. The adult clock measured grief in months. The child clock measured it in missed breakfasts, dark bedrooms, and who came when she called. Ruth saw the situation through routine. She called on the same evenings, came to preschool events, and asked practical questions about sleep, nightmares, and clothes. Thomas mailed June postcards because Michael once had. Between Linda's requests for more time and Ruth's insistence on predictability, I began to see 2 clocks running at once. Adults measured grief in months. June measured it by who came when she called. By fall, our household had settled into something that looked normal from the outside. That was the danger. Vanessa left early. Graham and I handled mornings. June and Toby went to their separate childcare programs. I picked them up most afternoons. Vanessa returned for dinner when she could. On weekends, she sometimes took June out alone, and those outings reassured me enough to keep postponing harder questions. Then there were weeks when she barely seemed to live with us at all. Vanessa began talking about advancing to another role. Ambition itself was not the problem, we all had careers. The problem was what happened when ambition collided with responsibility, and Graham watched me absorb more and more of that collision. One night after Vanessa had missed another preschool meeting, he waited until both children were asleep. He told me we needed to stop pretending the structure would correct itself. I said Vanessa was functioning better. He said functioning at work was not the same thing as parenting at home. I reminded him June had just lost her father. He reminded me Toby had not stopped needing parents because someone else's tragedy was larger. Graham's reminder that Toby had not stopped needing parents simply because someone else's tragedy was larger finally got through to me. Our son's adaptability had begun to look, in my exhausted mind, like proof that he needed less. I had grown up as the child who handled things, and I knew how easily adults rewarded children for making themselves convenient. The next morning, I packed both children's lunches. June wanted strawberries. Toby wanted whatever June had. The kitchen floor was sticky because somebody had spilled juice. Vanessa came downstairs in heels, carrying her laptop bag and searching for her car keys. She kissed June's head on the way past. June barely looked up from her cereal. There was nothing dramatic about it. That was why it frightened me. People imagine abandonment as a door slamming. Sometimes it is a child continuing to eat cereal because she has learned the adult leaving the room is not part of the morning she can control. I began pushing Vanessa harder through logistics, rather than accusations. If she would be late, I needed notice. If June had an event, I needed to know whether Vanessa was attending before I rearranged my schedule. If she was traveling, she needed to tell us in advance, instead of assuming I would cover. Vanessa reacted badly. She said I was turning family help into a contract. I told her family help should not require guessing whether a child's mother would come home. For several weeks, things improved. Vanessa handled more pickups. She spent one full Sunday with June. She even took Toby with them to a children's museum once, returning both kids exhausted and sticky from something she claimed was frozen yogurt. I let myself believe Graham had been wrong. Or maybe not wrong. Maybe simply premature. Then, in January, Vanessa came home with a folder from work. I remember the folder because she left it on the kitchen counter beside a pile of preschool artwork, and the contrast bothered me before I knew why. Her company offered her a 9-month San Jose assignment with more visibility, more money, and a path to permanence. It was close enough to drive and far enough to make ordinary weekdays impossible. Vanessa looked alive in a way I had not seen since before Michael died. She looked alive in a way I had not seen since before Michael died. She spoke about the team she would lead, the exposure, what it could mean for the next stage of her career. I listened. I knew exactly how dangerous it was to tell a woman she should shrink her future because she was a mother. I also knew June was asleep down the hall in the room she now called hers. I asked what Vanessa planned to do about her. The excitement in my sister's face changed. Only slightly. She said the assignment would begin in March. There was time. She could rent something small at first, then figure out what made sense once she knew whether the role would last. I assumed what made sense meant deciding when June would join her. Vanessa did not say that. Instead of answering whether June would go with her, Vanessa talked about school, routine, grief, our house, Toby and June's bond with me. Every point was reasonable, which was precisely what made the direction of the argument clear. Graham asked later whether Vanessa intended to take June with her. I said I did not know. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I did not want to hear. He thought Vanessa already knew. A week later, I found out he was right. I was folding laundry in the hallway when I heard Vanessa and June in the bedroom. I did not stop because I wanted to listen. I stopped because I heard my name. Vanessa was talking gently. That made it worse. She explained that she might have to work somewhere else for a while. She asked June whether she would want to leave her preschool, whether she would miss Toby, whether she wanted to sleep in a different room, whether she would rather stay with Aunt Andrea until everything was settled. This was January, 2 months before Vanessa was due to leave. June was 4 years and 8 months old, still asking Graham to leave the hallway light on and checking for her stuffed rabbit before longer drives. Vanessa softly told her there was no wrong answer, but she had framed San Jose as the loss of every safe thing June knew. Standing in the hall with Toby's shirt in my hands, I understood that she was not asking a grieving child what she wanted. She was asking for permission. I did not walk into the bedroom right away, and I have judged myself for that more than once. I stood in the hallway with Toby's shirt folded over my hands and listened long enough to understand the shape of the choice Vanessa was putting in front of a 4-year-old. San Jose was new. Our house, preschool, Toby, her room and nightlight were familiar. Her father had already disappeared from one home forever, and Vanessa was asking whether she wanted to leave another one. By the time I stepped into the doorway, June was sitting cross-legged on the bed with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm. Vanessa sat beside her, angled close enough to look comforting. June answered before I had found a way to interrupt without frightening her. June wanted to stay with me, not forever, not in the way an adult would understand it. She wanted to stay here while Mommy worked, where everything felt safe and reversible. Vanessa hugged her so quickly that I knew she heard something different. Later she told Graham and me that June had made her choice. I remember watching a drop of water gather on the kitchen faucet while I thought that June had chosen a bedroom, a preschool, and a familiar breakfast table. She had not chosen to live without her mother. Instead, I told Vanessa the closest thing to the truth I could manage without shouting. She's 4. She can choose her cereal. She doesn't get to choose whether she still has a mother. Vanessa's face hardened. She said I was treating her like she had announced she was disappearing forever. San Jose was a 2-hour drive on a good day, not another continent. The assignment was 9 months. June had lost enough stability already. Dragging her into a temporary apartment, away from preschool, away from everyone she trusted, would satisfy some abstract idea of motherhood while making the actual child miserable. The worst part was that she was not entirely wrong. June did need stability. She had already been uprooted by death in ways none of us could undo. She had finally started sleeping more than a few hours at a time. Her nightmares were less frequent. She had friends at preschool. She knew where the bathroom light switch was in the dark, and which cabinet Graham kept the crackers in, and how far she could push Toby before he screamed for me. Removing all of that had a cost. So did leaving her behind. The argument was never simple enough for one of us to win. Graham understood that better than I did. Graham did not tell Vanessa to refuse the assignment. He asked for a schedule she could keep. Regular calls, planned weekends and holidays, and a date to reassess. Vanessa agreed. We sat around the dining table with a calendar marked for visits in April, May, and June, including a promise that she would be home for June's birthday. On paper, it looked responsible. She talked about finding a larger apartment if the assignment became permanent. She talked about parks near the office and school districts she had looked up. June wandered through the room with Toby behind her, dragging a plastic truck by one wheel. She had no idea the adults were trying to build a bridge across 9 months of her childhood. For a while, the bridge held. Vanessa moved to San Jose in March. She rented a furnished studio near work and came back the second weekend as promised. June spent most of Vanessa's first promised weekend glued to her side. They went to the zoo, and Vanessa bought the stuffed giraffe that barely fit beside the car seat. June cried when she left Sunday, but it was hopeful crying. Mommy had come back once, so she would come back again. The next calls happened on time, and I let myself believe the arrangement might actually be temporary. Then April came. Vanessa canceled one weekend because a client meeting was moved. It was inconvenient, not alarming. People with jobs had meetings. June already had her small overnight bag packed when I got the message. A purple sweatshirt, 2 pairs of socks, a book she wanted Vanessa to read. She had chosen her clothes herself and put the stuffed giraffe beside the front door. I told her the visit had changed. Her face stayed still for a few seconds. Then she asked whether Mommy was coming the next weekend instead. I said that was the plan. She nodded. Okay. She took the giraffe back to her room. Vanessa did come the following weekend. Enough promises were kept to make each broken one feel like an exception, which is why I did not recognize the larger pattern yet. May was harder. A call came late, another slipped to the next day, and Vanessa missed a preschool event after a meeting ran long. She sent flowers, but June spent the event looking toward the door every time another adult entered. By then, I had stopped promising Vanessa would come until I could see her car in the driveway. I still explained the misses as work, traffic, and effort because I thought I was protecting June from resentment. In practice, I was softening the meaning of Vanessa's absence. The practical problems forced the next change. June lived with us most of the time now. Daily logistics eventually forced a change. June lived with us most of the time, and school and routine medical decisions could not always wait for a parent 2 hours away in a meeting. As her aunt and relative caregiver, I could use a caregiver's authorization affidavit for school enrollment and ordinary medical and dental matters. It did not make me her legal parent or terminate Vanessa's rights. It simply gave the person handling June's daily life enough authority to do it. I told Vanessa what I intended to do before I completed it. She barely objected. In fact, she sounded relieved. That bothered me more than resistance would have. She said it made sense. It would keep routine things from becoming emergencies. She promised we would revisit everything when the assignment ended. Vanessa promised we would revisit everything when the assignment ended. I kept hearing that phrase, while temporary paperwork and temporary plans accumulated around a child, learning which cabinet stuck and where we kept the extra toilet paper. Our house was already becoming the answer to questions the adults still called temporary. Graham and I started arguing more. Not constantly. That would have been easier to identify. Our marriage did not suddenly become hostile. It became tired. He noticed that June's dentist appointment appeared on our calendar without discussion. He noticed I had turned down a Saturday work opportunity because Vanessa had canceled. He noticed Toby had started crying when I left the room at bedtime because too many evenings had ended with me sitting beside June until she fell asleep. Graham never asked me to choose between the children. He asked me to notice that I was already making choices. I hated hearing Graham say I was already making choices because he was right. June's grief was urgent and visible. Toby's adaptation was quieter, so June often got the extra half hour or changed plan while Toby was praised for understanding. The pattern scared me because I recognized it from my own childhood. The capable child quietly being asked to need less. One evening, after Vanessa changed another weekend at the last minute, Graham found me moving our plans around again. We had been supposed to take Toby to a small railway museum he had become obsessed with because he believed every train was personally waiting for him. June's visit with Vanessa had overlapped, which meant the outing was supposed to be simple. Graham, me, Toby. When Vanessa canceled, my first reaction was to change the museum trip. I did not want June spending the day watching the rest of us do something planned for when she was away with her mother. Graham asked why that automatically meant Toby lost his day too. I said June had just been disappointed. He said Toby would also be disappointed if we taught him that every time Vanessa failed June, his plans disappeared. I stood in our bedroom holding 2 shirts. I had been packing into a small backpack and wanted to tell him he was making children compete for compassion. Then, I looked at the little wooden train Toby had left on our dresser. Graham was not asking me to care less about June. He was asking me to stop making Vanessa's failures contagious. We took both children to the museum. June liked it more than Toby did. Toby spent 20 minutes crying because the red train was not running that day. There was something almost comforting about the ridiculousness of it. A child being devastated by the wrong train was a problem I knew how to solve. We bought him a cheap wooden whistle in the gift shop and regretted it before reaching the parking lot. For one afternoon, nobody talked about Vanessa. I needed more days like that. Instead, summer arrived with another cancellation, then another schedule change. The caregiver's authorization affidavit solved school and routine medical logistics, but it did nothing for the larger problem in our marriage. Graham and I had never actually decided we were raising June. We had simply kept waking up and doing it. One night, after June had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for a call Vanessa eventually made almost an hour late, I carried her to bed. When I came back downstairs, Graham was in the kitchen, cleaning a cup that was already clean. Cleaning an already clean cup was one of Graham's tells. He said we could not keep pretending the arrangement had no endpoint. I heard accusation where there was mostly fear, and the argument sharpened until he said the sentence June would carry for years. We can't keep living like she's ours if Vanessa still gets to act like none of this costs us. We can't keep living like she's ours if Vanessa still gets to act like none of this costs us. I knew he meant Vanessa could not keep the identity of motherhood while assigning its daily consequences to us. June did not hear the whole sentence. She heard only, "We can't keep living like she's ours." The next morning, June made her bed without being asked, put away her bowl, helped Toby find a shoe, and gathered crayons I had told her she could leave out. I thought she was having a good morning. Only later did I understand how fear could look like cooperation. The pressure between Graham and me did not disappear. A few days later, after another exhausted argument, Graham took Toby to his brother's for 2 nights, so the house could cool down, and Toby could have a couple of ordinary evenings. I agreed. The second night, June noticed Toby's room was still empty. She found me sorting laundry in the hallway. For a moment, she stood there twisting the hem of her shirt between her fingers. Then she asked whether Graham had left because of her. The basket slipped against my hip. I set it down before I dropped it. June was not crying. That made the question worse. She looked prepared for the answer, as if she had already decided this was how families worked. Michael was gone, because something terrible had happened. Vanessa was living somewhere else, after June said she wanted to stay. Now Graham and Toby were gone for 2 nights, after the adults had argued about her. A 4-year-old did not need a therapist's vocabulary to find the common denominator: herself. I crouched in front of her. I did not give her a speech. I told her Graham and Toby were coming back. I told her the argument belonged to the adults. Then I made one promise carefully, because I had learned to fear promises made too easily. Nothing she had said about wanting to stay had caused any adult to leave. She looked at me for several seconds. I could see she wanted to believe it. Wanting and believing were already becoming different things for her. Graham and Toby came home exactly when Graham had said they would. I made sure June saw the car turn into the driveway. Toby ran inside carrying a plastic dinosaur. His uncle had apparently decided our house lacked. June hugged him so hard he complained. Graham looked at me over both children's heads. We did not fix our marriage in that moment. We did something more useful. We stopped pretending the problem was temporary. Over the next several weeks, I began changing how I handled Vanessa. I stopped automatically filling every gap before anyone else had to notice it. I told her canceled weekends required real notice. I told Linda I could no longer be the only person absorbing the consequences whenever Vanessa needed time. I spoke more regularly with Ruth and Thomas about June's needs. I started researching what would happen if a 9-month arrangement became longer. Most importantly, I began asking Graham before I changed the structure of our household. By late summer, Vanessa's visits had become inconsistent enough that June no longer packed until the morning of a trip. I noticed that too. The stuffed giraffe stopped waiting beside the front door. She still loved Vanessa. She still brightened when her mother arrived, but expectation had begun protecting itself. Vanessa, meanwhile, sounded better than she had in months. She liked the San Jose team. The company liked her. And she had begun speaking about the assignment less like a temporary placement and more like a life she was building. Then she called me one evening while I was putting groceries away. June and Toby were in the living room, arguing about which cartoon they had watched the day before. Graham was outside, replacing a broken sprinkler head. Vanessa's voice had that careful tone she used when she wanted a decision to sound like a circumstance. Her company wanted to extend the assignment. There was a path to making the role permanent. She had not agreed to anything final yet, she said, but the original 9-month timeline no longer made sense. I closed the refrigerator. The milk carton was still in my hand. I asked when she planned to come back to Sacramento permanently. There was a pause. Not long. Long enough. Vanessa said she did not know. I stood there listening to the refrigerator motor hum behind the closed door. For months, I had been waiting for a temporary arrangement to end. June had been waiting for her mother to finish working somewhere else. Graham had been waiting for our household to stop expanding around an absence nobody would name. But when Vanessa said she did not know when she was coming back, the temporary language finally broke. She had not made one dramatic decision to abandon her daughter. She had made dozens of smaller decisions that kept moving her farther away. And now, for the first time, I understood that she might have no intention of finding her way back. Vanessa saying she did not know when she was coming back should have felt like an answer. Instead, it created a different kind of uncertainty. Until then, every inconvenience in our house had been tied to a date somewhere in the future. The assignment would end. Vanessa would decide. June would move. We would reevaluate. Graham and I would get our office back. Toby would stop asking why there were 2 toothbrush cups in the upstairs bathroom. Life would settle into whatever shape it was supposed to have been before Michael died. Once Vanessa admitted she had no return date, I could no longer organize our family around an ending that did not exist. I stopped making excuses for her. Not in front of June. I was careful about that. A child did not need me poisoning the image of the mother she still loved. But when Vanessa canceled, I no longer called it traffic if she had chosen a meeting. I no longer rearranged 3 other people's schedules before asking her whether she had another solution. I stopped treating her inconvenience as an emergency, simply because I knew I could solve it faster. The first time I did that, my hands shook after I hung up. Vanessa had called to move another weekend because of a last-minute work obligation. Normally, I would have opened the calendar before she finished explaining. Instead, I told her I needed her to propose the replacement date. There was a pause, then another. She seemed genuinely surprised. Her surprise showed me how invisible the consequences of her choices had become whenever I absorbed them efficiently. Graham noticed the change before he commented on it. I began asking him before I moved family plans, not for permission to care for June, but because every long-term decision now affected his life and Toby's too. We started sitting down once a week after the children were asleep and going through schedules the way other couples might go through bills. We began sitting down once a week after the children were asleep to coordinate June's appointments, Toby's daycare, our work travel, Vanessa's visits, and what either of us could reasonably cover. It was not romantic, but it became one of the most important things we did for our marriage. It was probably one of the most important things we ever did for our marriage. I admitted that I had made decisions too quickly because waiting felt like failing June. Graham admitted that some of his anger had come from fear more than principle. He had watched one emergency spread through our house until it seemed permanent, and he had no language for saying he loved June without also saying he was frightened of what our family was becoming. Neither of us got everything right, but we stopped pretending one person could carry enough responsibility for 5 adults and children if she just worked harder. That was when Graham's relationship with June began to change too. Until then, I had been June's obvious safe person. Graham mattered to her, but I was the one she looked for when she woke from nightmares, or scraped her knee, or became quiet after a phone call with Vanessa. One night, Toby was running a low fever and refused to sleep anywhere except against my chest. June woke from a nightmare sometime after midnight. I heard her door open from down the hall, then heard Graham before I could move. Graham did not try to become Michael or promise there was nothing to fear. He simply sat on the hallway floor outside June's room and told her he would stay until she wanted him to leave. From where I sat with feverish Toby against my chest, I watched him remain there long after June stopped moving. Toby's forehead was warm against my collarbone. The hall light cast a narrow stripe across the carpet. June eventually climbed back into bed, and Graham remained outside her door long after she stopped moving. After that, June slowly began bringing Graham practical problems she had once brought only to me: a loose bike wheel, a broken toy, something out of reach, and joining him on errands with Toby. The first time Graham cooked breakfast for them alone, he nearly undid all the emotional progress by trying to make pancakes. Graham was good at many things. Pancakes were not among them. I came downstairs to find one stuck to the pan, one folded over on itself like wet cardboard, and a third so dark, Toby had apparently asked whether it was a cookie. June was sitting at the table with both hands around a glass of milk, trying very hard not to laugh because Graham still believed he could save the batch. He could not. We ate cereal. For years afterward, whenever Graham approached pancake mix, June and Toby treated it as a public safety issue. By the time they were teenagers, they had declared him legally prohibited from breakfast batter. The pancake disaster became one of those small family jokes that proved our life was not built entirely around grief. June still carried Michael and still waited on Vanessa, but our house also contained ridiculous breakfasts, blanket forts, television arguments, and ordinary mornings. Ruth helped with that in a different way. Ruth helped by remembering Michael as an ordinary person instead of a saint. She told June about the time he locked himself out in gym shorts, his terrible singing, his hatred of mushrooms, and the haircut he spent months trying to hide. June could laugh about her father without losing him. Ruth and Thomas never acted as though Graham or I were stealing Michael's place. They seemed to understand that love did not work like a chair at a table where somebody had to stand if another person sat down. Michael remained June's father, and Graham could still become someone she trusted. None of that required erasing anyone who deserved to remain. By 2013, it was obvious Vanessa's move was no longer temporary. Her San Jose role had become permanent. She had moved from the furnished studio into a larger apartment. Calls still happened, but not with the reliability of that first calendar we had made. Visits existed around work rather than the other way around. Some months were better. That was one of the things that made the pattern difficult to explain later. Vanessa could still show up beautifully. She could arrive with the right birthday gift. She could take June for a weekend and remember how she liked her sandwiches cut. She could make June feel seen for 6 hours. Then she could go quiet for 3 weeks. Children are not confused only by absence. They can be even more confused by intermittent presence. A parent who never appears eventually becomes a fact. A parent who appears just often enough remains a possibility. By then, the caregiver's authorization affidavit was no longer enough for the life we were actually living. June was in school. She had regular medical needs, activities, permissions, emergencies that had not yet happened but eventually would. More important, our family had stopped being able to honestly describe her place with us as temporary. Graham and I did not reach the guardianship decision in one heroic moment. It emerged through school calendars, medical permissions, tax questions, June's belongings already being home, and Toby introducing her as his sister without checking the technical definition. I began researching formal guardianship. This time, I did not move first and explain later. I sat with Graham before filing anything. We talked about what guardianship meant practically: legal authority for June's day-to-day care, court supervision, and an official structure for the life we were already living. Graham did not answer immediately. He looked toward the ceiling, where we could hear Toby running down the hallway and June telling him not to touch something that was almost certainly hers. When Graham asked whether I was sure, I told him I was not. I knew June needed permanence. Vanessa was not providing it, and I loved the child upstairs. I did not know what the next 11 years would cost our marriage, or Toby, whether June might someday resent me, or whether Vanessa might suddenly want everything back. Certainty could not be the condition June waited on forever. In 2014, after nearly 2 years of June living primarily with us, I filed in Sacramento County Probate Court to become guardian of her person. So in 2014, after nearly 2 years of June living primarily with us, I filed in Sacramento County Probate Court to become guardian of her person. The process involved forms, formal notices, a court investigation, and questions about our household, June and Vanessa. Ruth and Thomas supported the petition. Thomas had once wondered whether June might be better off living with them. By then, even he admitted moving her again would solve an adult discomfort by creating another loss for the child. Robert, my father, was still uneasy about what the responsibility would mean for my marriage, but he preferred a formal structure to the indefinite arrangement we had been living inside. Linda struggled because the guardianship forced her to face what giving Vanessa time had become. June needed another adult to hold legal responsibility for her. She did not oppose us. Neither did Vanessa. Vanessa received formal notice, could have objected or proposed another arrangement, and instead supported the guardianship on the same ground she had used before June was stable and changing, that would be selfish. The court granted it. The court granted the guardianship. I did not leave feeling victorious. I left carrying a folder. June held my hand walking toward the parking lot, more interested in whether we could get ice cream than in the legal meaning of what had happened. That was probably healthy. The order did not erase Vanessa or Michael. It made the law catch up with the reality that June lived with me and I was responsible for her. Vanessa remained her parent and could later seek visitation or ask the court to terminate the guardianship if circumstances changed. She never did. At the time, I told myself she was respecting June's stability. Years later, that unused legal doorway would matter. Another part of Vanessa's life had already begun. I knew little about it at the time. What I know came later. She met Daniel in 2013. He knew she had a daughter, but Vanessa gave him a softened history in which June lived with relatives after Michael's death, was deeply attached to me, and had remained there because uprooting her would be cruel. Daniel believed she had sacrificed closeness for June's stability. I lived inside parts of it too. There had been days when I had said almost the same thing. June needs stability. Moving her would hurt her. Let Vanessa settle first. Give it time. The difference was that I was still there each morning, watching what the passage of that time actually did. In February 2014, Vanessa gave birth to Chloe. June was 6 years and 9 months old. I expected the news to be difficult. I underestimated why. June did not melt down when she learned she had a baby sister. She was curious. She wanted photographs. She asked whether Chloe had hair. She asked whether babies cried all night. The first picture Vanessa sent showed a tiny red-faced infant wrapped in a hospital blanket. Vanessa looking exhausted and happy. June stared at it for a long time. Then she asked whether Vanessa was sleeping much. I told her probably not. For the next several months, ordinary evidence of Vanessa's new motherhood reached us. Chloe in a carrier, talk of feeding schedules, a pale curtain nursery. Vanessa awake at night with a teething baby. None of it was aimed at June. That was what made it hurt. One evening, I found June sitting at the dining table with a school worksheet in front of her and one of the printed baby photographs nearby. She had been quiet for most of dinner. I asked if she needed help with the worksheet. She shook her head. Then she asked if babies woke their mothers up a lot. I told her they could. She asked whether Vanessa still went to work when Chloe cried at night. I said I did not know exactly how Vanessa and Daniel arranged things. June looked back at the photograph. June looked at the photograph and quietly absorbed something I would only understand later. Vanessa could rearrange mornings, lose sleep, and build daily routines around a child. She was doing it now, just somewhere else. After Chloe was born, June's questions about Vanessa slowly changed. Then they stopped. I almost missed it. That is the truth. For years I had measured June's pain by her questions when Mom was coming, whether she would call, whether she knew about an event. Then weeks passed without any of them. June simply stopped arranging expectations around Vanessa and became almost too easy to raise. She gave Toby the larger piece, told me school events did not matter if work was busy, let other people choose the movie, and picked the cheaper option when Ruth offered to buy something. Adults called her mature. I began to hear the danger in that word. I had been praised for making myself convenient too, and I recognized the same shrinking in June. I pushed back in small ways. Anything did not count as a dinner preference. Her school events mattered, and being older did not mean Toby automatically got what he wanted. I could not talk her into belonging. We had to demonstrate it by showing up until the pattern became believable. By the time June was 8, she had started calling our house home without qualification. Vanessa was still mom sometimes. Sometimes she was Vanessa when June spoke about her to friends. I did not correct either. The first time June called me mom, where I could hear it happen during an ordinary school pickup. I heard her tell a teacher her mom was there, looked behind myself for half a second, then saw her wave at me. I got us into the car without turning one spontaneous word into another decision she had to manage. We drove 3 blocks. Then I missed the turn toward home. June looked up from whatever she was doing in the passenger seat. "Mom, you missed it." I stared through the windshield. The next intersection was coming too fast for a graceful correction. I told her I was taking the scenic route. She looked out at a row of familiar suburban buildings and pointed out that our scenic route included a dry cleaner and a tire shop. I laughed so suddenly I had to wipe beneath one eye before she could notice why. She never asked whether I heard what she had called me. I never asked whether she meant to. She just kept doing it. She kept using the word not every time at first, but enough. Years passed. Years passed. The guardianship remained under court supervision until June turned 18 in May 2025. I filed what I was required to file. I kept school and medical life moving. Vanessa's contact existed in uneven pieces. Ruth and Thomas remained present. Graham and I learned to fight better. Toby and June learned to fight about almost everything else. By August 2026, June had been legally free of any guardianship for more than a year. She was 19. No one owned access to her. That was the reality Vanessa walked into when she appeared on my porch. And now, after everything that had happened, another child was reaching toward June from the family Vanessa had built after leaving her. Chloe's message arrived 2 days after June showed me the disputed sentence in Vanessa's declaration. I learned later that the custody dispute had brought June's name into conversations Chloe could hear. Once Chloe knew she had an older sister and knew her name, finding June's public social profile did not take much. The message contained one line: "Are you really my sister?" For several seconds, June did nothing. I watched her thumb hover above the screen. There was no anger in her face. What I saw instead was something I remembered from the night she had studied Chloe's baby photograph years earlier. Wanting, hurt, curiosity, and shame for feeling any of them. I did not tell her to answer. I did not tell her not to. That restraint still did not come naturally to me. June lowered the phone. Then she looked at me and asked the question I had been avoiding since Vanessa returned. What am I supposed to tell her mom did? June did not answer Chloe that night. She left the message open on her phone while we finished putting groceries away, then carried it upstairs with her as if it weighed more than the device in her hand. I let her go. Years earlier, I would have followed June upstairs and found a reason to hover. At 19, she did not need me standing over her shoulder while she decided what kind of sister she wanted to be. The next morning, she said she had replied simply, "Yes, they were sisters. No." Chloe had done nothing wrong, and the adult history was too complicated to dump onto a 12-year-old through a message request. Chloe answered within an hour. The conversation stayed cautious at first. June told me only what she wanted me to know. Chloe asked ordinary questions before she asked painful ones. Where June went to school, whether she lived with me, Whether Toby was really her brother or technically her cousin. Whether Michael had been nice. June answered the last question faster than the others. Yes, he had been. She did not turn him into a saint. She told Chloe he hated mushrooms, sang badly, and once tried to convince a 4-year-old that pancakes counted as dinner because he did not feel like cooking. The description made Chloe laugh. That mattered to June. I could see it in the way she looked at her phone afterward, the corners of her mouth lifting before she remembered the larger reason they were speaking. For a few days, the conversations stayed light. That gave our house room to breathe. One afternoon, June and Toby revived the argument over the car when the fuel gauge dipped below a quarter tank. Toby blamed June. She produced a time-stamped gas receipt with prosecutorial speed. Graham listened from the counter and said our car-sharing system apparently needed a witness, a fuel log, and possibly a notary. June laughed hard enough to lose the serious look she had carried since Chloe's message arrived. Then, Chloe sent another message. June's smile faded only a little. I watched her read. She did not show me immediately. Later that evening, she sat beside me, on the back patio while the heat finally began to lift from the concrete. Graham was watering a row of plants that survived more through stubbornness than gardening skill. Toby had disappeared into his room with headphones. June told me Chloe had been describing school. Nothing extraordinary. A science teacher Vanessa liked. A dance recital Vanessa had nearly missed because of work but had rearranged meetings to attend. A bakery where Chloe and Vanessa went after dentist appointments, because apparently Vanessa believed sugar was the correct reward for dental care. June smiled when she told me that part. Then she mentioned something small that caught her off guard. Chloe hated raisins. So had Vanessa. Not ordinary dislike. Vanessa had always treated raisins as a personal insult to grapes. June had inherited the same habit. For years, she had picked them out of trail mix with the concentration of someone removing landmines. The discovery made her laugh. A real laugh. Then the laughter disappeared. That was how the pain often arrived with June. Not in a separate room. Right beside something tender. I did not ask what she was thinking. She told me anyway. Chloe knew the names of Vanessa's co-workers. She knew which side of the car her mother preferred to park on. She knew what Vanessa ordered when they stopped for coffee. She knew which school events Vanessa hated and which ones she secretly enjoyed. None of those details mattered individually. Together, they described daily motherhood. June stared through the patio screen toward Graham's uneven row of plants. She said she hated being jealous of a child who had done nothing wrong. There was no bitterness in her voice toward Chloe. That made it sadder. June did not want Chloe's life taken away from her. She wanted to know why there had never been room in Vanessa's life for both of them. I reached for her hand, then stopped before touching it. June noticed. She slid her hand toward mine. That small permission meant more to me than anything I could have said. For years I had tried to answer questions June never should have needed to ask. Why Vanessa missed something, why she did not call, why another family seemed easier. By then I had learned some questions were not mine to answer. Across the state, Daniel was asking questions of his own. Daniel handled it carefully, which mattered because I was still wary of becoming part of a divorce strategy. Our first conversation had made me wary of becoming part of a divorce strategy. I did not want June's childhood converted into ammunition any more than I wanted Vanessa to rewrite it. Daniel's attorney requested certified copies of the 2014 guardianship record through the normal process, rather than asking me to hand over a personal archive. When Daniel later contacted me, he had learned the basic facts independently. Vanessa had received notice. She had not contested the guardianship. The file reflected her non-opposition. There was no record of her later asking the court to terminate the guardianship. No petition seeking a formal visitation order. Those facts did not prove she had never wanted June. I told Daniel that directly. Court records could tell you what someone filed. They could not tell you every thought they had at 2 a.m. Daniel agreed. His concern was narrower. Vanessa's current declaration described her as though she had repeatedly tried to find legal and practical routes back into June's life, and I had effectively closed them. But the guardianship court had never been a locked door. Vanessa simply had not walked back through it. Daniel wanted to understand why. I had spent years supplying explanations for Vanessa's stability, grief, distance, work, not wanting to confuse June. Each contained some truth. The problem was what happened when they were lined up beside the record. I told Daniel I could not testify about what Vanessa privately intended. I could only say what happened. She did not contest the guardianship. She did not later ask the court to end it. She did not seek a visitation schedule through that court. There had also been no order barring her from contacting June. Daniel thanked me and left it there. That restraint made me trust him slightly more. Not completely, slightly. The more the legal case tightened around facts, the more Vanessa began moving through family instead. My mother called on a Sunday morning. Linda had a particular way of beginning difficult conversations by discussing something unrelated first. She told me Robert's knee was bothering him again. She asked whether Toby had decided what he wanted to do after high school. She mentioned the heat. I waited. Eventually, Vanessa's name arrived. My mother had spoken with her. Vanessa was devastated. According to Linda, she felt everyone was comparing notes behind her back. Daniel was using June against her. Chloe had started asking questions. I was apparently reopening things that had been settled for years. Linda asked me to consider giving Vanessa a chance, not trust or forgiveness. Just a chance. At least she came back, my mother said. That sentence landed in a place already rubbed raw. I looked across my kitchen. June had left a mug in the sink. Toby's backpack was on the floor where I had told him not to leave it. Graham had written milk on the grocery list in block letters because he believed the rest of us were apparently incapable of noticing an empty carton. 15 years of staying were visible all around my kitchen, in chipped dishes, dental records, school photographs, curfew arguments, and 2 teenagers fighting over gasoline. My mother wanted me to give moral credit for showing up at a front door once. I kept my voice low. I reminded Linda that I had not contacted Daniel first. I had not posted about Vanessa. I had not sent June's messages to anyone. I had not asked Chloe to reach out. Vanessa had put the past into a sworn declaration. The past had answered back. Linda went quiet. Then she said she did not want to lose another daughter over this. There it was. Another burden placed where she knew it would be carried. I told her I did not want her to lose Vanessa either, but being the bigger person had become family shorthand for asking the person already carrying the most weight to pick up one more piece. I was done doing that automatically. The call ended without resolution. For the rest of the morning, I could hear my mother's sadness beneath my anger. Linda had not created Vanessa's choices, but she had spent years patting the edges around them. Every time Vanessa fell, Linda found a reason the floor should have been softer. I wondered how many times that had taught my sister she could avoid impact if someone else absorbed it. That afternoon, Toby found me sorting old tax files at the dining table. I was not building a case. At least that was what I told myself. I was checking what records naturally remained, and what I should stop wasting energy trying to reconstruct. Toby stood beside the chair long enough that I knew he wanted something more important than car keys. He asked whether I remembered the railway museum. Of course I did. The useless wooden whistle had survived years longer than it deserved. He remembered something different. He remembered that the trip had almost been canceled because Vanessa changed June's plans again. I had assumed most of those years blurred together for Toby. They had not. Toby sat across from me and told me he had loved June his whole life. He said that first because he needed me not to misunderstand what came next. There had been times, especially when he was younger, when every problem in the house seemed to bend around June. If she was having a bad day after Vanessa canceled, plans changed. If she was afraid, I stayed longer. If she needed something, everyone adjusted. Toby understood why once he was older. He had not understood when he was 8, or 10, or 12. At those ages, he only knew that June's sadness had gravity. Every time June was sad, everything changed. The sentence was not cruel. That was why it hurt. I closed the file in front of me. My first instinct was to explain Michael, Vanessa, and trauma. I caught myself before turning June's pain into another reason Toby should have needed less. I asked what he remembered most. He thought for a while. Not one dramatic event. That surprised me too. He remembered smaller things. Me leaving a school fundraiser early because June had gotten a call from Vanessa and shut herself in a bathroom. A camping trip delayed because June's weekend changed. Me saying more than once that he was old enough to understand. Toby hated that phrase. He said it had always sounded like being older meant losing the right to be disappointed. I could not argue. I told him I was sorry. Not for raising June. Not for staying. For making his flexibility invisible. Toby rubbed both hands over his face in the embarrassed way teenage boys sometimes do when a conversation becomes more sincere than they planned. He said he had never wanted June gone. I just wanted you to notice I was still there. His sentence followed me for days. It stripped away the clean version in which I had simply saved June, and everyone else happily adjusted. Graham and Toby had paid for choices I made too. Keeping June was still right, but pretending there had been no cost would have been another kind of dishonesty. A few evenings later, Chloe asked June the question we had known was coming. June was sitting at the kitchen island while I prepared dinner. She had been messaging Chloe on and off for nearly a week. I did not read over her shoulder. I did not need to. Her face changed. She set the phone down. Chloe had asked whether June had ever tried contacting Vanessa herself. The kitchen knife paused against the cutting board. I kept slicing the bell pepper. Because June had asked me to let her explain in her own order. After a moment, she said, "I didn't find her because I wanted another mom. That was all she gave me. And I did not push. Whatever she had gone looking for at 16, she was telling me it was not a replacement family." Before she was ready to say more, the legal case moved again. The question stayed unfinished, because the legal case moved before June was ready to finish it. 2 days later, Daniel's attorney served a new declaration from Vanessa in response to the relocation opposition. I did not receive the entire filing directly from Daniel this time. My attorney obtained the relevant portions because Vanessa had again made statements involving me and June. The declaration was more explicit than the earlier one. Vanessa described a pattern in which I had become progressively controlling after the guardianship. She said I discouraged direct contact and created an atmosphere in which June came to see Vanessa as someone who had chosen another family over her. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Vanessa stated under oath that as June grew older, June never independently contacted her outside my influence or control. I read the new declaration twice. June stood beside me, reading the same sentence. As she grew older, Vanessa claimed, June had never independently contacted her outside my influence or control. June's breathing slowed, and her face settled into decision. She tapped the paragraph. "I can prove that's false." She tapped the paragraph with one finger. "I can prove that's false." I expected a screenshot or an old saved image. June shook her head, unlocked her phone, and said, "It's not a screenshot. The whole conversation is still in my account." June did not hand me the phone. For most of June's childhood, my hands had gone toward whatever hurt before I thought. By 19, she knew that reflex well enough to stop it. Standing at the kitchen island, with Vanessa's declaration beside her and the phone in her hand, she asked me to sit, listen until she finished, and not fix anything yet. The request stung because it came from experience. I put both hands flat on the table. Graham sat beside me without touching the declaration. June remained across from us. For a few seconds, the only sound in the kitchen was the refrigerator cycling on. Then she began with the part I had misunderstood for years. She had not gone looking for Vanessa because she wanted a mother. By 16, June already had one. She did not say that dramatically. She did not look at me when she said it. The certainty was in the way she continued speaking, without pausing to see how I reacted. She had a home. Graham had been part of her daily life for so long that she no longer remembered when she stopped thinking of him as the man whose house she lived in, and started thinking of him as Graham, simply Graham, one of the people who would show up. Toby was her brother in every way that mattered to either of them. Ruth and Thomas kept Michael alive in stories instead of turning his death into a shrine. June was not 16, and desperate to be rescued from us. She was 16 and carrying a question. The same question, she told me, had been sitting inside her since she was small enough to believe adults meant exactly what they said. She remembered Vanessa asking whether she wanted to stay with us. Not every detail, not the full conversation. June remembered the bedspread beneath her legs. She remembered holding her stuffed rabbit. She remembered being told she would have to leave her room, her preschool, Toby and me, if she went with Vanessa. She remembered saying she wanted to stay. And then, she remembered her mother leaving. Children do not build timelines the way adults do. They build cause and effect from whatever pieces they can reach. June had spent years with a sentence she never said out loud. I chose Aunt Andrea, and Mom went away. Even when she grew old enough to understand how unfair that logic was, understanding did not erase it. By middle school, she knew a 4-year-old could not make a parent abandon responsibility. By high school, she understood the guardianship had been an adult decision. She knew Vanessa had options. She knew I had not packed Vanessa's apartment or forced her into a job or ordered her to miss birthdays. She knew all of that, but knowing was not the same thing as being free of the question. What if Vanessa had misunderstood her? What if a grieving little girl saying, "I want to stay here," had sounded to Vanessa like, "I don't want you"? What if Vanessa had stayed away because she believed June had rejected her first? June told me that thought embarrassed her by 16. She knew it was childish. That was exactly why she had never brought it to me. She was afraid I would reassure her. That surprised me enough that my fingers moved against the tabletop. June saw it. She explained that reassurance was not what she wanted. If she had asked us, Graham, Ruth and I would all have told her Vanessa's departure was not her fault. Even Linda would have framed it as an adult decision made in grief. But every answer would have come from someone who loved June. She needed Vanessa's. At 16, June found Vanessa through ordinary public information and social profiles. Vanessa was not hiding under another identity. Once June knew her married name, she was easy enough to locate. June spent almost a week looking before she sent anything. She told me she spent almost a week looking at Vanessa's profile before sending anything. That detail hurt in a way I had not expected. A week. My daughter had been sitting under my roof, going to school, eating dinner with us, arguing with Toby, and privately studying the life of the woman who had given birth to her. She saw Chloe. She saw Owen, still little then. She saw vacations, school pictures, a family Christmas card Vanessa had posted publicly. Nothing extravagant. That was what June noticed most. The ordinary things. A kitchen counter covered in cupcakes. Chloe leaning against Vanessa in a parking lot. Owen asleep on Daniel's shoulder while Vanessa took the picture. June did not find evidence that Vanessa had become someone extraordinary. She found evidence that Vanessa had become ordinary in a family that did not include her. That was harder. June said she nearly stopped there. She almost convinced herself that looking had been enough. Then one night in September 2023, she wrote the message. She still had it. The entire thread was sitting inside the same account she had used that night. June unlocked her phone and opened it. She did not slide it across the table yet. Instead, she told us what she had written. June's first message was careful, because she was terrified of sounding as if she wanted something. She identified herself, made clear she was not asking for money, a visit or access to the younger children, and promised she would not cause trouble. Only then did she ask whether Vanessa had stayed away, because she believed June had chosen me and no longer wanted her. Graham looked down at the table. I kept my hands where they were. If I moved, I knew I would reach for June. She was not finished. Vanessa did not answer immediately. According to the timestamps, several hours passed. June had watched the message status change. Delivered, then read, nothing. She went through dinner with us that night while waiting. I tried to remember September 2023. There had been nothing remarkable enough to preserve in my memory. Toby would have been 14. June had recently started driving alone more often. Graham and I had been arguing about whether we needed to replace the washing machine. I could not remember June seeming different. That realization made something ache behind my ribs. She had become so practiced at carrying pain quietly that I could sit across from her at dinner while she waited for her biological mother to decide whether she deserved an answer. Vanessa eventually replied. The first part of her response was cautious. She asked how June had found the account. She said she was surprised. She mentioned that her younger children did not know the full circumstances of June's life and that contact could create confusion. June had tried once more to make herself smaller. She told Vanessa she did not intend to contact Chloe or Owen. She did not want to appear at anyone's house. She only wanted an answer about the choice she had made when she was 4. Had Vanessa believed June did not want her? That was when Vanessa stopped circling. June turned the phone in her hand. When she finally looked at me, there was no 16-year-old uncertainty left in her face. She was 19 again. She said Vanessa's next message had answered more than the question. Then she placed the phone on the table between us. I looked down. The original thread showed the dates, account identity, and full exchange. My eyes found the line before I wanted them to. Please don't contact me or my family again. For a few seconds, I could not hear anything else. This had happened in 2023, when June was 16, and I had known nothing about it. No adult had stood between them. June had found Vanessa herself, asked her careful question, and received that answer. The word that caught in me was family. Vanessa had placed June outside it. I dug my thumbnail into my finger until the small pain gave my anger somewhere to go. I felt my thumbnail dig into the side of my index finger. That small pain was useful. It gave my body somewhere to put the anger. June watched me carefully. I knew what she was waiting for. Not an apology. A reaction she would have to manage. I forced my hands open. She continued before I could say anything. At 16, she had cried. That surprised me only because of how rarely June admitted it. She had waited until everyone was asleep. Then she had put a towel against the bottom of her bedroom door, because she was afraid I would see the light and come check on her. That detail nearly broke me. She had not been afraid I would punish her. She had been afraid I would comfort her, because comfort would require explanation. An explanation would hurt me. June said the strangest part was that underneath the pain there had been relief. For most of her childhood, some part of her had believed she caused Vanessa's first departure. After that message, she could not believe it anymore. At 16, there had been no court, no gatekeeper, and no 4-year-old confusion between them. Only June asking whether her mother had misunderstood her. Vanessa still chose distance. The answer was terrible. It was also an answer. June stopped wondering whether she had chosen wrong at 4. She finally understood the child had never been responsible. That freedom had cost her whatever hope remained that Vanessa's absence was an accident. I could see both things living in her while she told me. Grief and release. They were not opposites. Sometimes the truth hurts because it removes the last comfortable lie you had left. Graham reached for June's phone only after she nodded. He did not read every line. He looked at the dates and handed it back. His face had gone still in the way it did when anger had moved beyond words. I wanted to ask why June had not come to me. I knew the answer before I asked, but I needed to hear it. June rubbed the edge of her phone case with one thumb. She said she had almost told me that night. Then she imagined my face. She knew I would blame Vanessa. That was fine. What June could not bear was the other thing I would do. Blame myself. She had heard me over the years. Not every private conversation Graham and I had, but enough. She knew I sometimes wondered whether becoming her mother had made it easier for Vanessa to stop being one. She knew I had questioned whether I should have pushed for more visits, more calls, more confrontation. June did not want to hand me proof that none of my efforts would have changed Vanessa's choice. I had spent years believing I was protecting her from the ugliest version of our family history. For 3 years, June had been protecting me from it. The balance of the room shifted. I was the mother. She was the child I had raised. And somehow, I had become the person she had decided was too fragile for the truth. Vanessa had accused me of taking too much control. June's silence showed me a different cost of the same flaw. My daughter had learned to calculate what pain I could safely receive. By then, the message had been sent. The 16-year-old who read it had already cried alone, and no confrontation could travel backward. I stayed in my chair and listened. June said she had never contacted Vanessa again. She had not contacted Chloe. She had not contacted Daniel. She had kept her promise even though Vanessa had given it as a rejection rather than a request she owed. She went back to school the next day. She did homework. She drove to the grocery store for me that weekend. Life continued. That was one of the things abandonment had taught June too well. The world does not stop simply because something inside you has changed permanently. Eventually, the conversation returned to the paper beside us. Vanessa's declaration. June picked it up. The line stating that she had never independently contacted Vanessa outside my influence looked different now. Before, it had been suspicious. Now, it was provably false. I still did not want to turn my daughter's worst private moment into a weapon. Neither did June. She made that clear before I had to ask. If the thread was needed because Vanessa had put a false version into court, June would allow it there. She did not want it circulated through relatives, family chats, or social media. With June's permission, I contacted my attorney. She confirmed that the original account, timestamps, and surrounding messages should be preserved intact and handled through counsel if needed. When I asked about perjury, she refused to turn a serious factual dispute into a criminal conclusion from my kitchen table. The immediate issue was credibility and whether Vanessa would correct the record. Vanessa was given a straightforward opportunity to correct the factual claim. June had contacted her independently in 2023. I had not known, and Vanessa had ended the exchange. She did not need to confess her entire history or surrender anything else. For most of a day, I hoped she might simply amend the declaration. That hope embarrassed me later. But people do not stop hoping simply because experience tells them to. Part of me thought Vanessa would understand how dangerous the message was once she saw it in context. Another part thought she might finally recognize what the line meant to June. Maybe she would call her attorney and say the declaration had gone too far. Maybe she would amend it. Maybe she would say she had been ashamed, fearful, protective of Chloe and Owen. Anything that began with acknowledgement instead of denial. I did not hear from Vanessa directly. That was probably for the best. Her response came through counsel. I was at work when my attorney forwarded the summary. I read it standing beside the copier, while pages from somebody else's report slid into the tray. Vanessa was not withdrawing the statement. She characterized the 2023 exchange as being taken out of context. She maintained that my long-term influence had shaped June's attitude toward her, even if I had not personally arranged that specific contact. She argued that her request for June not to contact the younger children had been about protecting minors from sudden disruption, not rejecting June. Most importantly, she refused to correct the broader assertion that I had been the primary barrier between them. I read the response twice, beside the office copier. Vanessa would not withdraw the statement. She called the 2023 exchange context-dependent, maintained that my long-term influence had shaped June's attitude even if I had not arranged the contact, and described her rejection as protection for Chloe and Owen. She had been shown a fact and given a chance to correct the record. She chose not to. With the truth sitting in front of her, she was choosing the story anyway. Vanessa's refusal to correct the record changed the question for June. Until then, the 2023 thread had been private pain she kept to prove to herself that she had not imagined the rejection. Now the same words contradicted a sworn declaration. June still refused to turn them into family ammunition. She did not want screenshots sent to Linda, Chloe, relatives, or social media. If the messages were needed to correct the court record, they could be used there and nowhere else. "It proves what it proves," she told me. "It doesn't need to become entertainment." My attorney agreed, and the original account was preserved intact for counsel. Once that was settled, I turned to the records that already existed. The rest of the history already existed in ordinary records. The 2014 guardianship petition, formal notice, the order, Vanessa's non-opposition, and the annual reports I had filed. There was no confession hidden in them. Their value was simpler. The legal system had repeatedly recorded where June lived, who handled her daily care, and whether the adults entitled to object had done so. A legal system had asked who June lived with, who handled her daily care, whether the arrangement remained appropriate, and whether the adults who had a right to object had done so. Year after year, the answer had remained the same. June lived with us. I remained responsible. Vanessa did not return to court asking to end that arrangement. That did not prove what Vanessa felt. Feelings did not leave docket entries. But the documents made one thing difficult to sustain: the idea that I had secretly seized control while Vanessa stood helpless outside a locked legal door. She had known the door existed. She had participated in the process. She had chosen not to walk back through it. My attorney warned me not to turn the absence of filings into proof of motive. Vanessa could have avoided court for many reasons. The narrower contradiction was enough. She was now claiming she had been prevented from acting. That was where Vanessa's versions began to collide. She had told Daniel she sacrificed closeness for June's stability, while telling the court that I forced the distance on her. She also wanted the 2023 contact minimized, while maintaining that independent contact never happened. The evidence did not have to explain her motives. It only had to show where the accounts no longer fit. Ruth and Thomas became relevant next. I dreaded that more than the paperwork. Records did not have feelings. Michael's parents did. Ruth had spent 15 years keeping her grief from becoming June's burden, and I hated the idea of dragging her back through old years because Vanessa could not tolerate an accurate sentence. I called anyway. I told her only what was necessary. Vanessa's current custody dispute had brought June's guardianship history into question. There might be a need for factual testimony about Michael's role before his death, and what the Hale family understood afterward. Ruth was silent long enough that I could hear the faint scrape of something being moved across her kitchen counter. Then she asked whether June was all right. Ruth's first question was whether June was all right. That had always been her compass. I told her June was holding up better than the rest of us. Ruth said that sounded familiar. When we discussed the history, she stayed disciplined. Michael had been an active parent before he died. The Hales had considered whether June might live with them afterward. They had ultimately supported her remaining with us, because another move, another school, another primary household would have added disruption to a child who had already lost too much. Ruth had never understood me to be barring Vanessa from contact. Thomas remembered the history similarly, though he had been more skeptical of me at first. He had once wondered whether June should live with the grandparents instead, and changed his mind only after watching her settle into our home. If Vanessa had later made a serious, sustained effort to rebuild parenting time, he would have expected us to support it carefully. He simply never saw that effort. Neither Ruth nor Thomas claimed to know every call or private conversation. Linda had a harder time with that discipline. My mother agreed to come to the house after I told her our attorneys might eventually need a statement about what she remembered. She arrived carrying a casserole. Of course she did. Linda had spent her entire adult life believing food could soften a room before difficult conversations began. Sometimes it worked. That afternoon, it did not. She put the dish in my refrigerator, wiped a spot from the lid that was not dirty, and asked how far all of this really had to go. I knew what she meant. Could we not correct the record without forcing Vanessa to confront every contradiction? Could Daniel not simply oppose the relocation based on the children's current lives? Did June's old pain really need to become part of a legal fight between two other parents? Those were not stupid questions. In fact, if Vanessa had corrected the declaration, I might have agreed with most of them. I reminded Linda that Vanessa had been given that option. She had refused. My mother sat at the kitchen table where June had shown us the message thread days earlier, her hands folded around each other. Linda finally admitted she was not afraid of court so much as of what would happen to Vanessa if all the explanations she had used for years stopped working. For most of my life, Mom had hidden that instinct behind patience. Give your sister time. Be patient. Do not make things worse. I told her no one was asking her to condemn Vanessa, only to say what she actually remembered, and admit when she did not know. After a long silence, Linda said she had spent so many years giving Vanessa time that she stopped noticing what the time was doing to June. She agreed to tell the truth as she remembered it. For once, I believed her. The next change came through Chloe. I did not witness it. I only knew what June later chose to tell me. Chloe had grown more curious after learning June existed, and curiosity is difficult to contain once a 12-year-old senses adults are answering around a question instead of answering it. She asked Vanessa whether June had ever contacted her directly. June did not know exactly how the conversation began or where they were when it happened. Chloe did not give her a transcript. What she told June was enough. Vanessa had not answered cleanly. She had said things were complicated. She had said June did not understand everything happening in the family at the time. She had said Chloe was too young to carry adult history. All of those things might have sounded reasonable if Chloe had not asked a yes or no factual question. Did June contact you? Vanessa had answered everything except that. Chloe sent June a message afterward. Chloe did not say she hated Vanessa. She asked why her mother had never told them that an older daughter had tried to reach her. June could have forwarded the thread and forced the issue. Instead, she told Chloe she was sorry the adults had left her with questions and refused to use private messages to make a 12-year-old choose sides. Chloe answered with a heart. Daniel's legal strategy stayed focused on Chloe and Owen. Their schools, routines, current substantial time with both parents, the distance to Seattle, and the practical cost of preserving Daniel's daily relationship with them. June's history mattered only because Vanessa had made her own decision-making and credibility relevant. He was not asking the court to punish Vanessa for June. June agreed to cooperate because she wanted a false history kept from deciding where two younger children would live. Vanessa understood the danger too. That was when she stopped speaking only through lawyers. She contacted June directly. Not with an apology, with an explanation. June showed me the message only after she had already read it twice. Vanessa acknowledged telling 16-year-old June not to contact her family, but she reframed the sentence. She had been afraid. Chloe had been 9 then. Owen was 5. Daniel did not understand the full history. Vanessa believed June appearing suddenly could destabilize the household. She said she had been trying to protect the younger children. Vanessa called the 2023 rejection an attempt to protect Chloe and Owen. June saw the pattern without needing me to explain every version of it. At 4, she had been left in place for stability. At 16, she had been kept outside Vanessa's new family for stability. Now, at 19, She was being asked to soften the truth to protect the same household. The person expected to absorb the cost kept changing. Vanessa asked June to meet privately. June refused, not angrily. She told her mother she would not help Daniel take Chloe or Owen away. She would not exaggerate. She would not tell the court Vanessa had never loved her. But she would also not describe a rejection as something it was not. The next line June sent was one of the few I remembered exactly. "I won't lie, so you can keep the children you chose after me." I closed my eyes when I read it. The line was not cruel. It was a boundary. Vanessa did not answer for several hours. When she did, she accused June of seeing everything through my version of history. That accusation had become almost automatic by then. June did not respond. She had already said what mattered. The legal process moved forward after that. Vanessa's refusal to correct the disputed declaration forced Daniel's side to spend additional time on the message thread, guardianship record, and related discovery. His counsel gave notice that he would seek a contribution toward attorney fees and costs based on litigation conduct that had increased expenses and frustrated resolution. Vanessa would have an opportunity to respond, and the court would consider her finances and the conduct involved. Vanessa's attorneys were told exactly what Daniel's side intended to argue. They were given another chance to narrow the disputed facts. Vanessa continued fighting the point. By then I no longer read Vanessa's refusal as strategy alone. Correcting the declaration would mean admitting June reached her when I was not involved, which would leave me unavailable as the central explanation for why their relationship failed. When the hearing notice arrived, I understood what the room would require. June's thread could enter the record because Vanessa had made it relevant. Ruth, Thomas, and Linda might be asked for limited facts. I might have to explain the guardianship and my own mistakes. Daniel would have to argue for his children without turning June into a weapon. Vanessa had spent years telling slightly different versions to different people. At the hearing, one account would have to hold. By the morning of the hearing, I had spent so much time thinking about Vanessa's lies that I had nearly forgotten what the court was actually there to decide. June was 19. No judge could hand her back to anyone. The children whose lives were still being arranged were Chloe and Owen. I repeated that to myself while Graham drove us toward Santa Clara County. The freeway stretched ahead under a pale California sky, and June sat in the back seat beside a canvas bag containing almost nothing she actually needed. She had checked it 3 times before we left the house anyway. Phone charger, water, a paperback she never opened. The kind of ordinary preparation people make when they need their hands occupied. She had agreed to be available if her evidence or testimony was required. That did not mean she was eager. Neither was I. For weeks, relatives had spoken about the hearing, as if Vanessa would finally be exposed. I wanted something narrower, an accurate record, because Vanessa had made June's history relevant to where Chloe and Owen might live. Still, part of me wanted someone official to say I had not stolen anything from my sister, and I hated that I still wanted it. Graham seemed to understand without asking. He kept both hands on the wheel and did not try to reassure me. That was one of the quiet gifts of being married to someone for 20 years. He knew when comfort would become another thing I had to respond to. June stared out the window most of the drive. At one point we passed an exit toward a shopping center, and I remembered taking her there years earlier for school clothes. She had been 11 and insisted on choosing the cheapest pair of shoes, even though they pinched her toes. I had made her try on 3 more pairs. Back then, I thought I was teaching her she was allowed to want things. Now, she was about to walk into a courtroom, partly because the woman who had taught her to need less was still trying to make the past smaller. The courthouse was all security bins, fluorescent light, checked phones, and attorneys moving faster than everyone else. It looked ordinary enough to hold far more fear than the building deserved. Daniel arrived with his lawyer. He nodded at us, but did not cross the hallway to begin some strategy conversation. I appreciated that. By then, the lines were clearer. Daniel had his case. I had facts. June had her own history. None of those things needed to be blended together for the truth to work. Vanessa arrived several minutes later. She wore a dark suit and carried herself the way she always did when she believed composure could become authority if she held it long enough. For 1 second, her eyes found June. Then me. She looked away first. I felt no satisfaction, only tiredness. The hearing began with the part I had expected to feel least personal. The lawyers summarized the current dispute. The lawyers began with the present dispute. Vanessa wanted to relocate Chloe and Owen to Seattle if she accepted the promotion. Daniel opposed it. Because their roughly equal parenting arrangement was still temporary and there was no permanent custody order, the court focused on the children's current best interests, school, routines, travel burden, each parent's time, and whether frequent contact with Daniel could realistically survive the distance. Vanessa's attorney presented Seattle as a genuine advancement with better pay and a senior role, plus a plan built around holidays, summers, video calls, and travel. The proposal was not absurd. That was why the dispute was difficult. Her career could advance while Daniel's daily parenting would shrink, and the children would trade one kind of stability for another. Then Daniel's side turned to the pattern Vanessa had chosen to contest. Daniel's side barely used the word abandonment. The argument was about decision-making. Vanessa had once made a career move, while a child stayed behind, and later described the distance as the child's choice and a necessity for stability. That history did not decide the Seattle request, but Vanessa had chosen to answer it with a sworn account of June's past. That made the account relevant. When Vanessa testified, I understood for the first time why Daniel had believed her version for so long. She did not sound like someone inventing a story. She sounded like someone telling a story she had rehearsed, until the distinction between interpretation and fact had thinned almost to nothing. Michael's death had devastated June. True, June had needed stability. True, June had wanted to remain in Sacramento. True, she had become deeply attached to me. True, moving her immediately would have caused another enormous disruption. Also true, Vanessa described those years with enough genuine detail that if I had not lived them, I might have believed the conclusion too. She described the years as an impossible choice. June stayed where she felt safest, my role grew, and Vanessa found it harder to regain meaningful access without creating conflict. She did not need to call me evil. She used flaws I actually had. I was protective, sometimes over-involved, and often too quick to decide what June needed. The question was whether those truths meant Vanessa had been prevented from showing up. The 2014 guardianship record then established the simple facts. Vanessa received notice, did not contest my appointment, and for years filed no petition to terminate the guardianship or seek a court-ordered visitation schedule. Vanessa's attorney did not deny those records. She argued that Vanessa had avoided litigation because she believed forcing the issue would destabilize June. That explanation was possible. It simply did not match the stronger claim in Vanessa's declaration that she had repeatedly been prevented from meaningful access. Ruth's testimony, when it came, was limited. She did not dramatize Michael's death. She did not accuse Vanessa of abandoning June. She confirmed Michael had been actively parenting before he died, and that the Hale family had supported June remaining with us because they believed another move would hurt her. She also said she had never understood me to be barring Vanessa from June. Thomas's recollection matched hers in the places that mattered. He admitted he had once questioned whether June should live with them instead. That admission helped rather than hurt. It showed the family had not simply formed a wall around me and declared every choice I made correct. Linda was harder to watch. My mother looked smaller at the witness table than she did in my kitchen. She admitted she had spent years asking everyone to give Vanessa more time. She could not provide exact dates for every cancellation and did not try. She said Vanessa had been grieving, then building a career, then building another family. She also admitted she had encouraged me to absorb more than I should have because she believed I was capable of it. Linda's testimony was not a grand confession. It was a tired acknowledgement that compassion for Vanessa had become a habit of postponing accountability. Then the 2023 messages entered the record. The air conditioner still ran, attorneys still moved paper, and somewhere in the hallway something metal hit the floor. The room did not need to become theatrical for the moment to change. June had found Vanessa independently at 16. The original account and timestamps established the exchange, and Vanessa's attorney did not meaningfully dispute that it happened. She argued context June had appeared unexpectedly. Chloe and Owen were young, and Vanessa feared disruption. Then the line was read, "Please don't contact me or my family again." I watched Vanessa while the words entered a record she could no longer edit. Her face barely moved. Whatever fear Vanessa had felt in 2023, she had now sworn that June never independently contacted her outside my influence. The thread contradicted that claim without needing a larger label. June confirmed only what was necessary. She had found Vanessa herself, had not told me, had contacted her to ask whether Vanessa thought June had rejected her as a child, and had stopped after being told not to contact Vanessa or the family again. Her voice stayed steady. I kept my eyes on my hands, so my reaction would not become another burden she had to carry. When my own turn came, I expected Vanessa's side to attack me. They did not need to. The better strategy was to expose my flaws and see whether I would defend them. I was asked about my role in June's life, about the caregiver's authorization affidavit before guardianship, about the 2014 petition, about whether I had become increasingly protective, about whether Graham and I had ever disagreed about how much responsibility we were taking on. The truth was uncomfortable enough. I admitted we had. I admitted I had sometimes moved too quickly. I admitted I had made decisions because waiting for Vanessa felt dangerous to June, even when those decisions placed more pressure on Graham. I admitted Toby had sometimes received less attention because June's needs looked more urgent. I admitted that by the time June was older, I could become overprotective. I did not admit blocking Vanessa because I had not. But I refused to pretend I had been perfect, just because perfection would have made a cleaner story. Vanessa watched while I admitted the mistakes that were mine. Maybe she had expected me to defend every decision. Instead, owning the real ones left less room for the imaginary ones. I had overfunctioned and sometimes spoken for June too quickly, but I had not blocked a court door or written the message Vanessa sent at 16. By afternoon, the focus returned to Chloe and Owen. That was where it belonged. By afternoon, the focus returned to Chloe and Owen, where it belonged. Daniel described ordinary parenting school drop-offs, appointments, homework, sports, and weeknight dinners, and argued that long-distance blocks were not the same thing as frequent presence. The court considered the children's ages, schools, community, travel burden, Vanessa's job opportunity, Daniel's flexibility, and each parent's ability to support the children's relationship with the other. June's history affected Vanessa's credibility. It did not replace the best interest analysis. By the time both sides finished, I felt emptied out. The court took a recess before giving the ruling. We waited in the hallway while the court took a recess. June sat between Graham and me. Daniel stood with his attorney farther away, Vanessa with hers. No one approached anyone. I kept thinking about Chloe and Owen, who would still have to move between these adults after the lawyers went home. When we returned, the judge gave the ruling carefully. The court denied Vanessa's request to relocate Chloe and Owen to Seattle. The ruling emphasized their current shared arrangement, meaningful relationships with both parents, established school and community lives, and the practical damage distance would do to frequent contact with Daniel. Vanessa herself remained free to move, but the children would not relocate under the proposal before the court. If she moved alone, the parenting schedule would have to change. The court also ordered her to contribute $15,000 toward Daniel's attorney fees and costs because her continued fight over the disputed contact history, after being shown the 2023 evidence and given a chance to correct it, had unnecessarily increased litigation expenses. I had imagined vindication might feel like release. Instead, I felt exhausted. The ruling addressed the children's move and Vanessa's current litigation conduct. It did not erase the fact that she remained Chloe and Owen's mother. The Seattle role had a start date, and Vanessa's company would not hold it indefinitely. Through the case, I later learned she chose to remain in California, and the promotion went to someone else. For the first time in this story, the adult, making the career decision, absorbed the direct consequence of preserving daily parenting. This time, Vanessa stayed. After the hearing, we did not leave immediately. June had gone to the restroom. Graham was downstairs arranging the parking payment because the machine had rejected his card twice and apparently decided emotional trauma was not enough for one day. I stood near a window at the end of the hallway. Vanessa approached when June returned. I saw her coming before June did. My body reacted before my mind did when Vanessa approached June, shoulders tight, weight shifting, the old instinct to move between them. I stopped. June was 19. I stayed beside her instead. Vanessa looked exhausted. For once, the polish had slipped, not dramatically. Her hair was still in place. Her suit still fit perfectly. But something in her posture had changed. She no longer looked like the woman who had stood on my porch believing she could purchase 15 years or threaten them into submission. She looked at June. Her first sentence was not an apology. Maybe I should have expected that. She said the court case had turned everything into something uglier than it needed to be. She said there were things June still did not understand about those years. June did not argue. Vanessa's eyes flickered toward me, then back to her daughter. I'm still your mother. The hallway seemed to hold the words between them. Once I would have answered Vanessa's claim that she was still June's mother with every night, form, birthday, and year I could remember. I said nothing. June looked at her for a long moment. By birth, she said. What happens next is my choice. Vanessa flinched, and June turned away because she was finished. We walked toward the elevator together, my hand at my side. The court had decided where Chloe and Owen would remain. The lawyers had dealt with evidence, and Vanessa had chosen California over Seattle. The relationship between Vanessa and June no longer belonged to any of us to define. As the elevator doors closed, one question remained. After being left twice, would my daughter allow Vanessa any place in her life at all? For 3 days after the hearing, June did not mention Vanessa, and I did not ask. I noticed the restraint in ordinary moments. June barefoot at the refrigerator, while Toby complained about the last clean spoon. Her calling that she would be home late. All three of us pointing to different places when Graham asked about the electric bill. The legal case had felt enormous while we were inside it. Then we came home, and the dishwasher still needed emptying. Vanessa remained in California. The Seattle promotion went to someone else. I learned that through the practical aftermath of the case, not from a triumphant announcement. Her relocation request had been denied, and if she wanted to preserve the substantial parenting time she currently had with Chloe and Owen, staying local was the only realistic choice. She stayed. The court had not taken the Seattle job from Vanessa. She chose to stay in California so she could preserve substantial parenting time with Chloe and Owen, and the promotion went to someone else. More than 14 years earlier, she had accepted a career move while June absorbed the disruption. This time, the adult making the choice carried its direct consequence. The $15,000 fee contribution was separate, a financial consequence for refusing to correct a disputed position after being given the chance, not a price placed on June's childhood. The divorce continued. June's message did not end Vanessa's marriage. Daniel and Vanessa had already separated, and the marriage was fractured by work, relocation, parenting, and trust before the 2023 thread entered the case. What the evidence changed was Daniel's ability to keep treating Vanessa's versions of events as complete simply because they sounded reasonable. The divorce continued, leaving Chloe and Owen with parents who would still have to exchange backpacks, coordinate school calendars, and make decisions together after the marriage ended. Chloe surprised me most. For several days after the hearing, she sent June very little. I worried that Vanessa had told her to stop. I also worried that the court case had put more weight on a 12-year-old than June, and I had managed to keep from her. Then one Sunday afternoon, June walked into the kitchen holding her phone with the smallest smile. Chloe had sent her a photograph of a disastrous cake. The frosting had collapsed down one side. The lettering was crooked. One corner looked as if someone had tried to repair it with a spoon. Apparently, Chloe had tried to bake for a friend's birthday. June stared at the picture and said the cake looked like something Graham would make if the court ever lifted his pancake restrictions. From the garage, Graham yelled that he had heard that. June laughed. Then she typed something back. June and Chloe's relationship continued through ordinary things: bad cake, school complaints, music and pet pictures. Not through testimony or Vanessa. Chloe still loved her mother. Sometimes she defended her. Sometimes she admitted anger about being kept in the dark, and June did not recruit her to either side. She understood that Chloe could love Vanessa and still recognize what had happened to June. One afternoon, June told me Chloe had asked whether Vanessa had ever been kind to her. The question could have invited 15 years of anger. June answered yes, because Vanessa had. There had been zoo trips, birthday gifts, weekends when Vanessa showed up and June came home happy. A mother could create beautiful memories and still fail the larger responsibility. That complexity had once confused June. By 19, it no longer frightened her. She did not need Vanessa to have been cruel every minute in order for the abandonment to be real. Linda came to see us the week after the hearing. She did not bring a casserole. That was how I knew the visit was serious. My mother sat at the same kitchen table where so much of our family history seemed determined to end up. She looked older than she had a month before, although I knew that was probably because I had finally stopped seeing her only as my mother and started seeing a woman who had made her own compromises. June sat across from her. I stayed nearby, but not beside June. Linda did not ask June to forgive Vanessa or help the family move on. She apologized for herself. She admitted that while she had spent years worrying about Vanessa's grief, career, shame, and second family, she had asked everyone else to wait and had not noticed a child starting to believe the guilt belonged to her. June let her finish without rushing to make the apology easier. Then Mom apologized to me for treating capability like endless capacity. When Vanessa struggled, Linda worried. When I struggled, she assumed I would manage. First, I could see the same pattern I had repeated with Toby. June did not give Linda a grand declaration of forgiveness. She simply said she appreciated the truth, and for that day it was enough. After Linda left, June carried the coffee cups to the sink. I watched her rinse them and felt something loosen inside me. Not forgiveness, not closure, something quieter. For the first time, June's childhood was being returned to the adults who had actually shaped it. Piece by piece, she no longer had to carry all of it herself. Ruth and Thomas came the following weekend, with photographs June had requested of Michael before she was born. A terrible first car, an embarrassing college shirt, a fishing trip neither Michael nor Thomas appeared to enjoy, and the famous bad haircut. June and Toby laughed over them. She still carried Hale as her last name, and I had never asked her to change it. Michael did not need to disappear for Graham, Vanessa, or me to have a place in June's life. Love did not have to be territorial. Toby and I returned to the conversation we had only begun before the hearing. He remembered loving June, and also competing with emergencies he could not beat, learning that his disappointment looked selfish beside hers. I apologized, without attaching an explanation. Toby then reminded me that June had also given him things. A sister who taught him to drive, covered for a broken lamp only long enough to make him confess, and sat through a school concert he pretended not to care about. He had lost pieces of my attention and gained June. He did not want us rewriting the family history in the opposite direction by pretending every sacrifice had been beautiful just because the outcome was love. We managed a 5-second hug before he remembered he was 17. Graham and I had our conversation later that night. Not at the kitchen table. We had given that table enough work. We sat on the back patio after everyone else had gone inside. The air was warm, and the sprinkler system Graham had repaired years earlier made its familiar clicking sound across the lawn. Later, Graham and I sat on the back patio. I told him I would still open the door to Vanessa and June, still care for June, and still seek guardianship when temporary care became permanent. What I would change was how I made those decisions. I would ask him sooner, stop treating his fear as lack of compassion, and notice Toby before he had to become easy. Graham returned to the sentence June had overheard years earlier. "We can't keep living like she's ours," and admitted that meaning well did not erase the impact of what she heard. We had both hurt children while trying to protect them. Staying mattered, but staying well required seeing the people beside us too. Vanessa's first apology arrived 2 weeks after the hearing. June did not show it to me immediately. When she eventually did, I understood why. The message began well. Vanessa acknowledged hurting her. She admitted the 2023 response had been wrong. Then came the word that had saved her from responsibility for years. But she had been afraid. She had been protecting Chloe and Owen. She had not known how Daniel would react. She had thought June was safe with me. She had never meant for the distance to become permanent. The sentences after but were polished enough to almost erase the sentence before it. June read the message once and put the phone away. She did not answer that day, or the next. When Vanessa eventually asked whether she had seen it, June replied that an apology followed by explanations was still asking the injured person to help carry the guilt. Then she stopped responding. I did not tell her what boundary to set. That might have been the most significant thing I did. Several weeks later, another message came from Vanessa. It was shorter and less polished. She wrote that she could see why asking a 4-year-old to choose had shifted responsibility onto June, why the 2023 message had landed as rejection, and why denying the contact in court had made the damage worse. It did not erase the years between them, and June did not treat it as forgiveness. When Vanessa asked whether a relationship was still possible, June answered with terms: no rewriting the past, no secret relationship hidden from Chloe or Owen, no contacting her only when Vanessa needed something, and no treating biology as automatic access. Any closeness would have to be earned through consistency. June did not promise how far it would go. For once, that uncertainty belonged to her. Weeks later, on an evening that should have been forgettable, I came home to shouting in the kitchen. I dropped my bag by the door and found June standing beside the refrigerator holding an empty cake container. Toby was at the counter pretending to be deeply interested in his phone. Graham was loading the dishwasher with the deliberate calm of a man who had already decided this problem did not belong to him. The last piece of chocolate cake had disappeared. June had apparently written her name on the container. Toby maintained that writing a name on shared food did not create an enforceable property right. I stopped in the doorway. For one dangerous second, the phrase, enforceable property right, reminded me of lawyers and courtrooms. Then Graham closed the dishwasher. He said if Toby wanted to argue precedent, he could begin by presenting the security footage from the refrigerator. There was no security footage. Toby looked genuinely concerned for half a second anyway. June burst out laughing. I did too. The sound filled the kitchen. Not nervous laughter. Not relief after a hearing. Just family noise. Toby finally admitted he had eaten the cake. June demanded compensation. He offered her one of Graham's pancakes. She said she preferred starvation. Graham objected from the sink. The argument continued around me while I took vegetables out of a grocery bag. I stood there longer than necessary, listening. I had once imagined healing as something obvious, a verdict, a conversation, an apology that made everyone cry. Instead, it looked like June arguing about stolen cake because she trusted tomorrow enough to care about tonight. Toby being angry without fearing love would vanish. Chloe loving Vanessa without denying June's history. And Michael remaining present in stories, without threatening anyone else's place. Whether Vanessa changed after that was no longer mine to control. June slid the empty cake container toward Toby and told him he was buying the next one. He tried to negotiate. She pointed toward me. "Mom?" I looked up from the grocery bag. "What?" June wanted me to what? I told her Toby owed the whole cake. He accused the court of bias. Graham said appeals would be accepted between 9 and never. June leaned against the counter, laughing. The word mom no longer knocked the air out of me the way it had during that first school pickup. This time I answered without thinking, because neither the word nor our family needed ceremony anymore. I no longer needed to prove that loving June had stolen something from Vanessa, or that Vanessa's failures made me perfect. June had been a child carrying choices adults made around her. The guilt belonged with the adults, not with her. The cake argument drifted into another argument about whose turn it was to take the car the next morning. Graham opened the refrigerator, stared at the fuel receipt June had apparently taped there as evidence from their previous dispute, and shook his head. I carried the grocery bag to the pantry. Behind me, June laughed again. There was a time when I thought my job was to keep that little girl from being abandoned, to stand in front of every door, to answer every question, to make myself reliable enough that she would never feel the floor disappear beneath her again. But June was not 4 anymore. She did not need me to stand in front of her. She needed me to trust the woman she had become, to let her decide what truth meant, what forgiveness meant, whether Vanessa would be family, acquaintance, something in between, or eventually nothing at all. My daughter had spent too much of her life carrying choices adults placed on her. The last one belonged to her. And this time, nobody was leaving because she chose for herself.